The most important thing is what exactly is the question asking for and not necessarily what you know about that particular topic. So very, very clear. So in case you're able to sort of address the core demand of that particular question, right, then you're on the right track. Okay, possibly going to score quite well in that question, possibly getting to the top 1%, top 5% for that particular question at least. It is not going to be that difficult, but you have to think, right? There is nothing in your notes that is going to be in one particular place, in one particular sequence that you can just close your eyes, recall and write. In order for you to be able to address the demand of the question, very, very simple. If you can take an example and connect all of these sort of elements and show especially thoda sa extra depth is, when you can show the past and the present, right? So you're basically showing at one particular point and another particular point, connecting it, right? You can't have a better answer than that. So hello and welcome to UPSC Anthropology Paper 1 analysis. To all of you who have written your mains, congratulations, it's over. Now it's time to relax and time to reflect, okay? Or maybe time to celebrate, right? Okay, so we can reflect a little later, right? But in terms of how the pattern of the exam was, and what was the difficulty level, what were the kind of questions, right? Many of you guys who are watching it probably did not have the chance to write it. I would suggest those of you who are watching this particular video, at least try to sort of brainstorm it once by yourself, maybe during this, maybe after this, okay, or preferably even before this. I think that will probably give you a little better idea of what was your way of thinking and what was probably UPSC, their actual demand, right? Exactly what are they testing? Right? So we'll take a look. So welcome. So this is going to be for your paper 1, right? So paper 1, we'll just take a look and let's see where we are at. See, generally the pattern and the marking year on year tends to be slightly different, right? So each year it is slightly different, but I would say that the general trends kind of remain the same, right? Okay, there is going to be a year in which, let's say that you have a slightly less kind of percentage that tends to go up a little bit, but the general sort of pattern is around the same thing. This year what you notice is basically you have a little more of biological anthropology, right? Some of the questions basically have biology and your social cultural anthropology, right? It has your biology with something else. So I've kind of divided the marks in case the question is about, let's say, biocultural something. So I'm giving half the marks to biology and I'm giving half the marks to your social cultural. So if you take a look at this, we have biology 127.5, right? Of course, it is not going to be 127.5 out of your 250. It is going to be 127.5 out of your total 400. Right? So this is something that you have to keep in mind. So this entire thing is out of 400, right? So it will not be very easy for you to be able to select 127.5 just from biology, right? So depending upon the choice of questions, the percentage is going to come down. It is going to be very different for each person based on their selection, right? But the blocks remain the same. You have questions of different types, right? So you'll have different kind of modules being selected, asked in the same sort of block of questions, right? So you have this. The next bigger bunch is going to be your theories and miscellaneous, right? So theories and miscellaneous was an important component even in the previous year, right? You had a lot of questions. In fact, theories had a lot more sort of questions. Chapter number 6 had a lot more sort of questions in comparison to your entire social cultural anthropology, right? And theories, and when I say theories and miscellaneous, I'm saying theories, your chapter number 6, 7, and 8, and then 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, right? Okay, so I'm just basically placing them in like one sort of block. So theories, last year you had a lot of 20 markers. You can see similar sort of trends this year as well. Long answer questions, you have it. Social cultural anthropology is around 18%. Around 72.5. Similar is your fossils. So fossils had a good chunk of questions, good analytical kind of questions, and questions that you had to attempt, right? So, and many of the questions were in the 10 markers as well. So this is the trend, okay? So in case you guys want, you can take a screenshot of it, right? Okay, so good challenging paper. Right. Okay. I would say it is a little more. We'll take a look, and we'll judge it once we are done with taking a look at these questions. So this is your first block of question. So for those of you who have already seen what UPSC paper is like, you probably know this, right? For those of you who are looking at it for the very first time, either you want to select anthropology or, how exactly are optional papers and how are they different from your GS papers, right? For those of you who are wondering that, let me make this very clear. You're going to be having 8 questions. Okay. So 8 questions make question number 1 and question number 5 are going to be 5 questions, and 5 and 5 are going to be compulsory, right? And then out of the other, so the first block is going to be 1 plus 3 other questions, and then second block is going to be question number 5 plus 3 other blocks. Okay, and those blocks are going to be A, B, C, मतलब 3 questions in each of these things. You have to select at least one from each block, right? So एक block में 2 select करना पड़ेगा, एक block में 1 select करना पड़ेगा. So this is going to be a compulsory block. So the first question is Mendel and non-Mendel. Okay, so Mendelian and non-Mendelian sort of traits. So what do you have here? So first question, relatively simple. So probably, they're trying to ease your, calm your nerves. So Mendelian traits are nothing but those that are going to follow the traits, the principles of Mendel, right? So you have your, segregation, independent assortment, dominance, recessive. Okay, so you can go with what exactly is the meaning, what are the kind of features, what could be the examples, tongue rolling, okay, the earlobes, right? So which one is dominant and which one is recessive, one is going to be attached, one is going to be free, right? And similarly, you should also bring in some sort of applications with regard to, let's say diseases, right? Some sort of human applications that are relatively important. So wahan pe kya hoga? So you'll basically have the single mutation sort of disorders, like in pedigree analysis, whatever you have studied, you could basically bring them in. For instance, sickle cell anemia, 11p, right? How exactly it sort of like gets, transmitted from one generation to another. You could probably bring in a Punnett square, say your parents are so and so, capital D, lowercase t, maybe capital D, lowercase t, heterozygous for both. Okay, how exactly is it going to be sort of, inherited in the next generation? So some of these kind of application, you have room to basically bring it in here, right? Non-Mendelian, again, fairly straightforward from your syllabus. It is going to be, let's say that, polygenic traits, right? It could be the exceptions, compared to Mendelian sort of traits, right? You could actually, depending upon how in depth you want to go, it's a 10 marker, so it will be a little difficult to go that far in depth, right? But polygenic traits, agar aapne mention kiya hai, then you're going to get a 5, 5.5 for this particular question, right? Okay, but in case you want to push a little further, you could probably talk about, maybe you can categorize them there as well. So you could basically talk about non-Mendelian traits in terms of the gene level. You could basically try to bring something at the chromosomal level. So gene level, we of course polygenic sort of traits, right? And again, you have to bring in examples, right? And those examples should be backed by specifics. So meaning, agar aap type 2 diabetes ke bare mein baat kar rahe ho, then you try to bring in at least a few of those, genes that could probably cause it. Or if you're basically bringing in, let's say, height, your skin, right? So it doesn't matter, right? So you should try to bring those kind of specifics as well, right? You could also bring it at the chromosomal level, right? So if it is non-Mendelian traits, chromosomal level, trisomy is something that you could bring in. You could basically bring it in, let's say, at the cytoplasmic level. So then you could basically talk about, mitochondria or any sort of disorders like this LHON, which basically affects the eye, right? So, something along those lines as well. But it's a 10 marker. I don't think it is very easy to sort of go that far in depth. The more important thing is that, you basically talk about what exactly is it, define it really well, talk about the features, talk about some examples, and talk about some applications, especially with regard to human health, right? So sickle cell anemia could be another one, autosomal recessive, show some specifics. 11p, you could basically bring in, autosomal dominant, maybe Huntington's. Okay, so you bring in your 4p. So the other one, the first one would be HPV gene. This is going to be your HTT gene. You could actually bring in, let's say, X chromosome se bhi aap le ke aa sakte ho, right? So you could basically bring in some hemophilia, and then you thoda sa, it gives you an option to probably draw some diagrams and link it in that particular manner, right? So these kind of things could be something that you could bring in X may, especially you can have the P part and the Q part and then show in Q part, in case you have some sort of forms, it could basically result in disorders that could follow Mendelian kind of disease patterns, right? So that is basically how you would write. Okay, it's a 10 marker, and that is that. Okay, theoretical significance of Purum kinship system. So Purum kinship system is something I think many students found it to a little difficult. Okay, and many of you had basically like one major sort of point, and that was with regard to what you knew about alliance system, right? Okay, so that is that, and you have to say कि उसका significance क्या है, right? ठीक है. Okay, so this is not the be all and end all. I'll mention this. In order for you to do well in a particular paper, you have to understand that it is not going to be the bouncers that decide how well you have done, right? So just like I told you in the past as well, how well have you done with 35 pages to 40 pages? Okay, so 35 pages if it's a moderate kind of paper, if it's 40 pages if it's kind of an easy paper, wahan pe have you been able to beat everybody else with half mark, 1 mark per page, per question, right? If you and consistently do this, that is basically how you're going to get to the top 1% and top 5%, right? So this is going to be, let's say that, most of you guys have only 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, doesn't matter, okay? As long as you've hit something here, okay, it is going to be more or less similar sort of marks for most of you, right? So it's not going to be much of a difference maker, right? But what exactly is the Purum kinship method, right? Alliance and alliance system, you must have studied, maybe some things you might know, right? So one thing is going to be, you have restricted exchange, you have generalized exchange, and Purum kinship is an example of your generalized exchange. So restricted exchange is A to B, okay, wife givers are going to be wife takers as well, but it is reciprocal. Here you're going to have A to B, B to C, C to A, right, and so on and so forth, right? So lateral, one direction, unidirectional is how it is going to be, right? Then you could basically bring in some sort of like structural components. For instance, kinship mein the group ka hierarchy. So within Purums, one thing that is noticed is, unlike in, let's say, Hindu society, wherein you actually have the majority, agar aap dekhoge, it is basically like the wife givers, okay, and wife takers ko agar aap compare karoge, the wife takers are essentially, at a higher sort of pedestal, hierarchy wise. Whereas here, it is the wife givers. Wife givers are the ones who basically provide life. They provide continuity, right? So, they are given a lot more sort of respect in that particular society. Another one that is kind of interesting about the Purum kinship, by the way, this is done by Rodney Needham, based on the works that were done by, the ethnographic work done by T.C. Das, okay, Tarak Chandra Das in the 1940s. So in this, he essentially mentions that, you have this marriage rules that we're talking about. And, of course, it is marriage, okay, and the question is asking you about the kinship, right? But these are all embedded, right? So what they have is that, you have marriage rules, you have your prescriptive, you have your preferential, and then you have your proscribed, right? So interestingly, in case, if I can just draw this. Okay, so for instance, let's say that I have, okay, Purum. Okay, so they have MBD. Okay, and then you have, okay, so this is considered to be their prescriptive form. Okay, whereas this is proscribed. Right, so let's say that there is a male ego. Okay, and then, so if there is a marriage here, right? So we know what it is, right? Of course, you label it, box it, right? So you show this, right? So this is going to be, for him, it's going to be the brothers, okay, brother's daughter. In that particular society, mother's brother's daughter is not even preferential cousin marriage. It is actually prescriptive, right? Okay, it is prescriptive. And then let us say that, aisa ek relationship wahan pe nahi hai for this particular guy, then it doesn't matter. It has to be somebody who has a similar classificatory kind of a relationship, meaning mother ka brother ka equivalent. Okay, it could be a cousin, but it should still be bhaiya ya bhai, younger bhai, that one of those kind of things. Similarly, if there's no daughter here, right, it has to be, a daughterish kind of a relationship. Doesn't matter. That is still preferred, in comparison to somebody outside. But at the same time, you have another sort of a cross-cousin relationship, right? Okay, which is the father. Okay, the father's sister's daughter. This cannot happen, right? This is basically considered as incest, right? So, Purums of Manipur, again, they have different sort of cultural practice, right, which has been studied and written about, and one of the very few societies wherein you have these kind of very specific sort of examples. The question also asked you specifically for, let us say, the significance. So what would be the significance, right? It actually provides you proof for such a scenario, right? Second thing could be the fact that, it helps you in structural analysis. It basically tells you that, it basically provides you proof for Levi-Strauss's and his alliance theory and so on and so forth. So that is going to be that, right? But do not worry about this particular question, right? So this is a question jahan pe, as far as I have spoken to the students who have written mains this year, right? Many of them did not have too many points in this particular question. They've been able to write something, right? But, I don't think anybody has been able to write it too well, right? That's that. Osteodonto-keratic culture. See, when I come here, I'll also tell you, ki, what does it basically take in order to write good answers or to score really well, right? To score well, okay, there are, let's say, 3-4 things that you should have to just simply put it. Okay, and let's say this is a pyramid that basically tells you what is important and how do you basically score, right? And what should be the hierarchy in terms of the scoring potential, right? See, the first thing that an answer should essentially have is that it should address the demand. Okay, the most important thing is what exactly is the question asking for, and not necessarily what you know about that particular topic. So very, very clear. So in case you're able to sort of address the core demand of that particular question, right, and then you're on the right track, okay, possibly going to score quite well in that question, possibly getting to the top 1%, top 5% for that particular question at least. Second thing should be that you should show conceptual clarity. And the way the questions are essentially structured, right, okay, and many of these questions you'll be able to see, it makes you think in the exam hall. It is not necessarily difficult, right, for a student who has enough knowledge about the syllabus, okay, and has good understanding of the practical aspects of how anthropology operates in the world, right. If you're able to look at the world and see and analyze through an anthropological lens, okay, it is not going to be that difficult, right. It is not going to be that difficult, but you have to think, right. There is nothing in your notes that is going to be in one particular place, in one particular sequence, that you can just close your eyes, recall and write, right. You have knowledge and you are aware of different aspects, right, but you've got to sort of like, connect it from here and connect it from here, from this particular handout, from this particular example, from this particular test, right, and then sort of bring it together and then be able to craft and sequence. How do you craft it? In a way that it basically addresses the core demand of that particular question, okay, using the concept, right? And then finally, it should also have, it should have, let's say, key evidence-based, okay? It should have a lot of facts. It should have scholars. It should have studies. It should have examples, right? So this has to be first priority, this has to be second priority, and this has to be third priority. And I'll mention this once again, right? If you have lots of scholars and lots of studies and lots of examples in an answer, but it does not address the core demand of the question, marks nahi milenge. The potential for a high score is relatively limited. Relatively nahi, matlab it is limited. Okay? Conceptual clarity, have you used the academic discipline in order to be able to answer that particular question, right? So this is another sort of an important element. Agar ye do nahi hai, but you have a lot of these things, again, it is not going to be a scoring sort of an answer. The first thing has to be, did you craft the answer according to the demand of that particular question? Did you use anthropology, right? Your anthropological knowledge, right? From different modules, from different parts of your syllabus, and use them in order to sort of address the demand of that particular question, right? And then third one is essentially, have you used a lot of scholars and studies and examples and other kind of specifics in your answer, right? If you've done all of these things, right, so that is going to get you, let's say, instead of a 4, it is probably going to get you a 6.5. Right? And that is exactly what is happening. So even in these kind of questions, what you should have done in order to differentiate yourself is to ensure, very simply, did you address the core demand of that particular question? Second thing, did you use the concept? When you write an answer, does it show conceptual clarity from your end? And third one, were you able to sort of bring in, scholars and studies and examples in order to be able to provide evidence, okay, or to substantiate the arguments that you're making? Right? This is essentially what is the demand. So if I take the third question, let's try to sort of look at it in this particular manner. Osteodonto-keratic culture and its makers. So what is the core demand of this particular question? The core demand of this particular question is that I am going to give you a particular term followed by culture. So there is a particular kind of a culture, right? Okay, so we have to write, about that particular thing. What are the debates surrounding this? Okay, this is a hypothesis, right? What are the different sort of views regarding this, right? And its makers. So this question essentially also has another part, which is going to be the makers of this particular culture. So this osteodonto-keratic, the culture, okay, or that debate, right, it's surrounding which particular hominin species, right? That is a question. So you have Australopithecines is the species here. Right? Okay, osteodonto-keratic culture essentially is what? It is basically a hypothesis that was introduced, in the 1950s, to talk about, what exactly would have been the culture, right, of the pre-Homo species. And that was your Australopithecine, right? Primarily, it was your Australopithecus africanus. Okay, Australopithecus, Australopithecine, okay, but africanus is start hua tha ye, right? So africanus is essentially where? Africanus is going to be your Southern Africa, right? So if I essentially have my Africa like this, okay. So we are essentially talking about this particular part, right? But it is also your entire Africa. So what we have here is that agar yahan pe aap dekhoge, right? So you have So let's say that I have my Taung, okay, I have my Startfontein, I have basically my Makapanskat, right? In all of these kind of places, what they had found is that they had, so now it is evident that it is going to be the place where a lot of fossils of Taung child, right? Your Africaners were found, okay, over a period of time, right? So you have this. So when you're trying to study their physical features, along with it, you also want to understand the reconstruction of the past. How did they live? Okay, what did they eat? What could the tools have been like way back in the day? Because there are direct ancestors, right? They are direct hominin family, right? So that's exactly what you have. So one of the things that was one of the hypotheses that was proposed, okay, osteodonto-keratic hypothesis. Okay, so osteodonto-keratic hypothesis essentially means osteo essentially means bone, donto essentially means tooth, yeah, teeth, okay, and then you have keratic essentially means horn. Right, and so this is a hypothesis that was, advanced by whom? It was done by none other than Raymond Dart. Right, so he essentially says that they had used tools that probably does not remain right now. Okay, unlike the stone tools, but we have evidences in certain sort of caves, especially your Makapanskat cave, right, wherein we see certain kind of bones. Have been left behind, certain sort of osteodonto and keratic kind of tools that have been left behind, right? But then this did not last very long. Okay, right after that, you had Lacrosse Clark, who basically said कि मतलब ये scientific नहीं है. After that, the most important sort of critique of this thing is going to be your Sherwood Washburn, right? So he essentially says कि Australopithecine, were they a predator or were they the prey? Right? Were they the hunted or, were they the hunter? Right? So it's a very famous book from the 1950s in which he says कि osteodonto-keratic hypothesis is incorrect, right? So this does not look like any kind of tool that a hominin species would have created, right? Just because it has been found in one particular place, scientifically, we cannot say that it is associated with the Australopithecines. Okay, it is not associated with your Africanus, and there is a lot more sort of support to that. And I'm not going to go into much detail about this, right? But I'm telling you, the demand of that particular question is osteodonto-keratic. So you're addressing what that is, and you are showing conceptual clarity. If you're saying that osteodonto-keratic culture is associated with Africanus, that is wrong, and it has been wrong since 70 years. Okay, almost 70 years. Right. So why is it wrong? Okay, because it has been proven that it has actually been left behind by predators, other predators, hyenas, right? Okay, Makapanskat has been sort of a place where today it is extinct, but a few different species of hyenas were found, possibly leopards were found, but primarily hyenas have probably left behind those after eating and munching and so on and so forth, right? So this is a theory that was proposed in the beginning, okay, and it did not last very long at all. Okay, so this hypothesis does not hold true today. Okay, it has been refuted again and again. But this question also has a second part, which is the makers. And I don't know how much of you, how many, words you would have still been left with, okay, or how many pages is left behind, okay, but you still have to sort of talk about, who are the major sort of species. Thoda sa ek diagram वगैरह लगा लो, okay, write some sort of specifics. You have your Africanus, you have your Afarensis, you have your Robustus, you have your Boise, you have your Anamensis, right? मतलब something about those things also has to be brought in here. If you have, okay, then, it is easy for you to be able to get to the top 5% or the top 1% for this particular question. Okay, so demand has to be addressed, meaning what are the different components that have been asked? Have you been able to address it? Okay, have you shown conceptual clarity by saying that it was a hypothesis? Okay, and it has been refuted as well. Yes, that means, okay, so conceptual clarity here. And then have you been able to bring in key Afarensis, Lucy, Downchild, Raymond Dart, okay, Donald Johansson, Robustus and Boise, bring in, M. Leakey, you try to bring in Broom, and so on and so forth. If you can bring in all these kind of things, the facts towards the end, then you've addressed all the parts of the question. Okay, you have the core demand addressed, you have your the conceptual clarity has been shown. At the same time, you have evidences, scholars and studies and examples and specifics in your answer. Okay, so that's it. Smell as a signal amongst non-human primates. Now this made me very happy because this is something that we had discussed in our laws ka conceptual session, and I basically told you guys that isko hum memorize karke nahi likh payenge because they're not asking you questions wherein memory is the main sort of a constraint, right? It is not, anthropology today is not a subject that is very memory driven, right? Nowhere in your syllabus basically they are asking you too many facts that you have to really cram and then dump. ठीक है, ऐसा नहीं है. It's more about conceptual clarity. If you guys remember this, and we talked about this, right? So this is from our foundation ka handout, primate taxonomy. So what did I tell you guys here? Strepsirini, okay, or strepsirines, and then haplorhines, right? So what the main sort of difference? Okay, this is going to be, this is basically your dry nose, this is your wet nose, right? So if you guys remember, I had, we made a joke about this, right? Remember it as strepsils. Strepsils you basically have when you have cold, okay? And you can actually see that it is a wet nose, right? And wet nose is basically when you have cold, right? All these funny kind of stories just to make you remember this, and that's exactly what they've asked you. So remember, in this entire sort of a chart that you see, the conceptual part here, okay, not the factual part here, is that, the further you go this side, it is going to be primitive kind of features, less human-like features, right? Human-like features, very different, okay, more we call it as advanced kind of features. So what do you have here, right? When you go all the way to the strepsirines, right? So you'll have your lemurs and lorises and galagos, okay, and previously even tarsiers, right? Tarsiers, it has been a debate, and they've actually brought it to this side, okay, based on anatomical, reproductive, genetic kind of patterns that we have studied today, but it used to be there. So lemurs, lorises, galacus, all these, they still have a lot more of olfaction, right? So their entire life is actually based on, less on visual, right, but more on their ability to smell things, right? So unke culture mein, if you take a look at it, okay, they have a lot more sort of importance that is associated to their ability to smell. Yahan pe, why do you have it? I think a good chunk of your syllabus essentially talks about the fact that they have become arboreal, and when you have arboreal, you have to ensure that, the ability to, visual, that 3D sort of view that you get, right, in order to be able to sort of like swing from branch to branch and have that, that clarity of that 3D depth, right, exactly how much you need, ye humne pad chuke hain. But in this, right, so on this end you essentially have that dependence on, the smelling ability itself, right? And what exactly is the dependence on this smelling ability, right? So for instance, this is an identity marker, right? Who's who is decided by the smell, right? Okay, so dominance is basically shown using the smell, right? Okay, mother infant, ka relationship, wahan pe there is the importance of smell. So you will see a lot of these kind of things still in this part, right? So the further you go from here onto this, you will be able to see this here, right? So if you can bring in this conceptual part in your answers, I think your answer will look a lot better. So core demand has been addressed, right? मतलब आप लिख लोगे कि कौन-कौन से हैं, right? And as you basically move towards the new world monkeys, old world monkeys, and the apes, right? You have a lot less of that. In fact, even if you write, the first sort of group here, as you come here, you will still have a little more sort of primitive features, but you will not have as much advanced features. So here, if you see here, even all the way till your new world monkeys, your marmosets, your tamarins, still there is some importance given to smell, right? Okay, that ability to be able to smell that. Okay, that is still strong, right? So that will be the 3 aspects addressed, right? So you have your specifics, you have your the core demand address, you have the conceptual clarity, right? And it is not a whole bunch of facts that is dumped in order to get marks, right? So that would be that. And we had discussed this, so I'm kind of happy that they had asked this, right? Another question is going to be culture and embodiment, right? So culture and embodiment, I'm hoping that most of you would have addressed this particular part well. Right? See, culture and embodiment. So in this particular kind of questions, we had already talked about this multiple times. What is the strategy that you should use? First thing, when you see a particular question that you kind of think right? At the same time, you're not very sure exact demand kya hai yahan pe, right? So this can actually be solved in like 2 to 3 steps, right? So what is the first step? First thing is for you to understand ki matlab, this is from which part of the syllabus. Okay. Second thing to be asked is essentially is going to be, okay, arguments to be made from, okay, so let's say this is my 2.1. So this, you make your arguments using the concepts from 2.1. Okay, we'll talk about what all you have. At the same time, for evidence or example, okay, you can go to any part of your syllabus. So here, let's say because it's socio-cultural, you can go to socio-cultural anthropology, you can go to Indian society. Okay, at the same time, you can also go to the tribal. Okay, and tribals, especially most of you, foundation students, okay, we've seen so many of these ethnographies jahan pe matlab you have tons and tons of examples that you can utilize in these, right? The only thing that you have to sort of like think in terms of these 3 rules, right? So the first thing is that it is from 2.1. So you can use the ideas from culture, society, civilization, right? Cultural relativism, right? Your social group, social institutions and whatnot, right? So yahan pe what would be most apt here? Okay, it could be culture, it could be culture and attributes, right? So these sort of elements, okay, and that is that. So you have to create some sort of arguments, okay, and those arguments should basically come from your 2.1. ठीक है, that is fine. So let's say कि culture and attributes अगर आप ले रहे हो, okay, another thing is going to be evidence and examples. And evidence and examples के लिए you could essentially go to any part of your syllabus wherein you can get some ideas, that you could probably use. So let's say that, agar aap culture and embodiment, right? So culture and embodiment. Okay, so embodiment. So what was given in English or in Hindi, embodiment is given as avataran. Avataran. Okay, so theek hai. If those of you know Hindi, you probably understood it a little better. Okay, and those of you who did not understand that, see, embodiment could be some form of manifestation, right? How does it basically sort of embody? Okay, how does it essentially manifest? Now I've seen 2 different kind of approaches that you guys have taken. I think both of you guys, both different sort of approaches are still pretty good, one slightly better than the other. So some of you have basically focused on this body, okay, and then you have tried to sort of like explain it a little more, ki how does a body, okay, how does it basically manifest, with regard to the body. So how did you start? So the first thing, so let's say ki what could be the core demand of the question, what exactly is culture, right? So what is culture? Okay, so you can bring in how many other definitions that you have, right? So for instance, let's say you go with E.B. Tyler, you go with Malinowski, right? Doesn't matter, right? Your choice, right? So E.B. Tyler basically talks about knowledge, belief, art, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a society. This is basically the apparatus, okay, in order to satisfy human needs or individuals' needs, right? So you could bring those sort of elements. And let's say in terms of embodiment, so let's say that, you talk about attributes. Okay, so essentially you have to try to break the components of whichever topic that you have and try to see if you can create some, let us say, some arguments from it, right? Okay, because from that, in that exam hall, I'm assuming that you know nothing else about this except for what you know about your particular syllabus, right? So syllabus to aapko pata hai, so yahan se aapko create karna hai. So in terms of attributes, what would you have? So let's say ki wo social hai, okay, then let's say ki it is transmitted, it is dynamic, okay, there is symbolic, okay, let's say it is learned. It's a 10 marker, so I don't think you'll have so much space to be able to experiment. But let's say you take learned, right? Okay, and then you say, how does it embody with an example? So a way to sort of talk about this thing is, and I'm talking about the examples that you guys have told me, enculturation, acculturation. Let's say that, you have a tribe from a particular state, let's say Odisha, right? Previously they used to have a lot of enculturation, learning about their own sort of culture, their own sort of religion, their own ways of life, their own language. But today with culture contact, displacement, land alienation, migration, they have, less enculturation. They have a lot more sort of acculturation, learning the Odia tongue, right? Rather than their, their own sort of language, their own sort of worldviews, their own sort of, different sort of aspects, right? So you could basically bring in something like this. Symbolic, again, you can bring in, your Turner, you could bring in your Nembu, you can basically talk about how that Madhi tree, what does it embody, right? Okay, so nurturing, motherhood, and so on and so forth. If it is dynamic, again, you can basically bring in, what could you talk about in terms of dynamic? Dynamic may, how does it basically embody? How does it basically exist in society? How does it basically, operate in society? You could basically say, for instance, let's say, again, if you want, okay, so you have actually taken the argument from your topic of your syllabus, but the example could be something from your social cultural anthropology, Indian society, or tribal, right? So yahan pe I could basically say that, tribe is becoming a lot more sort of caste-like, right? There is a lot more sort of Sanskritization that we can see here. Sanskritization. There's a lot of westernization. Okay, anything, right? So basically it is dynamic. It is not, just static. right? It changes in terms of transmission, right? So in terms of transmission, you can take any sort of an example. So for instance, again, another example that one of you told me is that you wrote about M.N. Srinivas, okay, and how he basically studied the, so I'm going to take this example, let's say, Kyle Pod ceremony, okay, of the Kurds. I'm not sure exactly what example you might have used, Kyle Pod ceremony. So this basically tells them about, worshipping their guns, okay, their weapons, and all of these things are essentially passed on to the next sort of generation, right? Okay, and so on. So this could be one of those kind of an answer wherein you are basically using nothing, okay, apart from what you already know in that exam hall from your syllabus, right? So you're making arguments, any kind of arguments, right? And this could be, in fact, like, you could make, you could take attributes and sort of make arguments. You could basically say, how does it embody with regard to social-cultural anthropology, institutions, marriage, family, kinship, economic, political, religion. That could be great as well. Some of you basically told me that the body wala element you had taken and you had essentially shown that, how does it basically embody there with some really good points, for instance, dance. And then you talked about, embodiment with regard to that. You basically talked about tattoos and the embodiment with regard to that with a lot of specifics, who uses what kind of tattoos. So some phenomenal sort of examples that you guys have used, right? All of those things should still, all of these basically are addressing the core demand, right? Because you've explained what exactly is culture and you're also showing how it embodies. The only thing that is basically different is how you've crafted your arguments there. Right? With regard to the examples, I think you have written really well. So these kind of questions, it is more important not to fact dump too many things, but how, well, you're able to sort of like create a structure, right? How do you basically create your arguments, right? So these kind of questions, again, this should be the pattern. So we had basically given you a particular way to think about it using 2-3 steps. And I think you guys have done that quite well. Okay. What are the other sort of questions? The Miocene hominoid remains and their significance in evolution. So this is a very good question, right? Compare and contrast symbolic approaches of Clifford Geertz and Victor Turner. I think this is a question that you guys have written multiple times, right? How political economy is integrated with ecological adaptability perspectives in biocultural anthropology. Okay. So let's talk about this in just a bit. Okay. See, Miocene hominoid remains and their significance in evolution, right? So they are asking you to discuss it. Okay. Hominoid remains and their significance in evolution. So if you take a look at this particular question, so I'll go in little detail in the beginning. So first thing is Miocene. Okay, you've got to know exactly what is Miocene, and which is not a very difficult thing. Okay, see, let's say it is something like this, and they're saying hominoid. Okay, now you guys should say, okay, what exactly is a hominoid? Okay, and then within this, what do they ask you? Discuss what? Discuss the remains. So within this particular period to this particular period, what do you have? I guess a good way to sort of categorize this could be, so isme, you could basically break this into hominid, okay, and then hominin, hominins, right? Okay, so hominoid. So you guys should know, right? Like, hominoid is essentially this entire primate family, right? When you talk about your hominids, it's basically, hominin basically is what your last common ancestor all the way till your, your present day humans, right? So this basically includes the other one. So matlab ye hominin, hominid, hominoid, these kind of differences should be very clear, okay? And you should be able to sort of communicate that your conceptual clarity with regard to these technical terms is not some facts, okay? But in case I have a diagram that is like this, right, you should be able to tell, okay, where exactly is your hominin? So hominin is essentially this, right? It's from the last common ancestor all the way till the present day humans, okay? And the same thing with regard to your hominid and hominoid, right? So in Miocene here, what could I have? I could basically have my proconsul, okay? And then we would have your Dryopithecus, okay? Then you would have your Ramapithecus, Shivapithecus, okay? Then you could have your Aureopithecus, right? And how do you have all of this? This basically goes back to which one? Your tertiary fossils. Okay, directly part of your syllabus, but asked in a different form, right? Your quaternary and tertiary forms. And then in terms of hominin, so this is all the way till 5.3, right? So so when you come to your 4 million years, you're going to have your Australopithecines. So what all do you have here? Okay, first of all, I should basically draw it in this particular direction, okay, with the past here and the present here. But it's okay, I'm just making it tabular, right? So I'll have my Sahelanthropus, okay, chadensis, okay, then you can have your Ororin, Tugenensis, right? Then you could have your Ardis, RD cadaba, okay, RD ramidus, and then eventually you have your Anamensis. Right, this is the whole sort of sequence, right? Even if you can basically talk about, like, you know, some important sort of development in each of these kind of phases, I think that will be a very, very strong communication from your end that, you know, ye sub is not a bunch of facts that I've memorized. Okay, I have very clear sort of idea about these, and it is not a very fact heavy question whatsoever. Right, so यहाँ से अगर आप जाओगे, this is most important because, you know, from the last common ancestor, okay, you have one line that is basically here, and from here you essentially have your first one, Sahelanthropus chadensis, right? Not necessarily part of your syllabus because we start only from Australopithecines, right? You basically have it from here. So, but you know, you should have some idea of like who are the ones. So, यहाँ पे what do you have here? So, for instance, the canines. Canines are becoming smaller than the other sort of apes. Ororintugenensis and Ardipithecus ramidus. Okay, bipedalism. Okay, so this one, it's the reason why Ororin is the most, it is known the most, okay, for what? Okay, it is basically known the most for the fact that, you know, bipedalism basically occurred, okay, with proper evidence that we have, okay, in comparison to your brain cut development, right? So, you know, brain size increase or your bipedalism, which one came first? And this was a huge debate in the beginning, right? So today we know because of the thigh bone here, right? So there is some form of bipedalism, right? Ardipithecus cadaba, okay, again bipedalism, right? Okay, but this is basically the toe bone. Okay, and then if you have your ramidus, what about the ramidus? Ramidus, okay, he is okay, very similar to the Australopithecine, but one thing that he still has is the grasping. So he becomes terrestrial along with arboreal. Okay, but grasping toe, grasping toe. And it is only when you have anamensis, jahan pe you have inline toes. Right? And that is that proconsul is basically what? Monkey to ape. Okay, so this is where it starts. So meaning loss of tail, right? Dryopithecus, what about Dryopithecus? Again, you know, you have some important, so ape-like locomotion. I'm not writing this like ape-like locomotion for the first time. Okay, there are many other ones. Okay, so arboreal to some extent. Okay, frugivorous. Okay, and then Ramapithecus, Shivapithecus, you have so many of these things. This guy, Oreo, is basically what? So you have your, it's a side branch. Okay, and insular adaptation. Okay, these are known primarily for just one or two things. So it's important that you understand that. Side branch essentially means what? So if I have some sort of a branch that is evolutionary branch, right? So this basically goes here, but it becomes extinct somewhere here, like your robustus and your boyce, right? So this is basically a side branch. And if I say insular, it essentially means what? Like island. So what was it? Near Italy, right? So somewhere in that particular area. So this becomes what? Its importance is that it becomes more specialized and less generalized. Right, okay, to be able to survive there, right? You know, in Florence is also, we've actually seen these kind of things. So if you have something like this, it becomes a very strong answer. You've got to understand pehle Miocene kya hai, right? You've got to be able to sort of like link it to your topic of your you know, quaternary and tertiary fossil. You have got to be able to bring it. So when they're saying hominoid, okay, they're basically asking you, if you write only this one particular part, okay, then you're missing out on all of these as well. And they have asked you for both. Okay, they have said hominoid. So if you've written only this particular part, okay, something is missing, right? So that is that. So this basically does what? So this essentially tells you that the core demand, okay, of the question has been answered because hominoid, both sides, okay. Conceptual clarity, yes, the sequence, and just one sort of addition to each one has been provided rather than fact dumping so many things that are like unrelated, because, you know, to describe one particular fossil that you find, you could have like, you know, 100 different things that you could basically be able to tell. But, you know, yahan se yahan, kya, what is the main thing that basically sort of changes? Okay, what is the one kind of advancement that basically takes place, right? Uska most important thing. So what is it most known for is something something that you've got to know, right? Okay, so that is an addition. So that basically makes this human evolution a proper, a continuous kind of a story for you, okay, especially when you are looking at it from the macro picture. Okay, so that basically addresses all of this. So symbolic approaches of Clifford Geertz and Victor Turner is something that you've done multiple times, right? Okay, political economy is integrated with ecological adaptability perspectives in biocultural anthropology. So I think two of you have told me that you've gone for this particular block, right? So political economy is integrated with ecological adaptability perspectives in biocultural anthropology. So and those of you who have not basically chosen this particular question, it is probably not because you don't know this particular answer, right? It's just that you're not 100% sure what exactly is the demand of this particular question. Kya pooch rahe ho? Is essentially the question here. How political economy is integrated with ecological and adaptability perspectives in biocultural anthropology. So, yahan pe you have to first understand what is the demand, right? The demand essentially is that political economy ko, okay, ecology ko, and biology and the cultural sort of adaptation ko link karna hai along with some perspectives, right? So, what would be a good way, right? So, you have to show, first of all, addressing the demand to ho gaya, then you have to understand, for instance, the conceptual clarity with regard to this. And this is very, very simple. So, for instance, let's see, one is the political economy. What was the next one? Economy. Okay, the second is going to be, what was it? Ecological. Okay, take care. So, let's say the ecological aspects. I'm writing very fast and, pardon my handwriting. Okay, then adaptability. And adaptability. Okay, now this is bioculture, right? So I'm going to go with cultural. I'm also going to go with biological. Okay, so what could it be? Right, you can take a simple sort of an example, jahan pe you can connect all of these things in order to be able to tell the story in a really good, easy kind of manner, right? So once you understand the demand of the question, it's actually very, very simple. Right, you can make it very simple, especially because it does not ask for many technicalities. Political economy. Okay, so what is the political economy of a particular social group? Okay, what could be the ecological sort of aspects with regard to that, and what could be the adaptability? In fact, agar isko thoda sa aur aapko depth mein leke jana hai, you can even go with what is the before and let's say after. Okay, with regard to a particular socio-cultural group, right? So let's say if I take the example of, let's say, Irulas. Right, okay, Aerolas. So political economy is basically what, right? So political economy was hunting and gathering, right? So you guys know, so they are basically in Nilgiris. I think it was asked in your paper too as well, right? So hunting and gathering kind of an economy. So and what could be the political side of things, right? So you will know, okay, hunting and gathering ke liye, how exactly will it be? So now basically what has happened, right? So from hunting and gathering, they've essentially become land alienation. Okay, and now they've essentially become like, let's say, wage labor. Okay, informal labor, right? So now they're part of the urban world or the rural world, okay, the rural villages. In terms of ecological aspects, what do they have? They have environment, okay, equals forest. And forests say their food, okay, and their livelihood. Everything is basically associated with it. Now, what about this, right? Today, okay, matlab, because displacement ho chuka hai. Okay, deforestation ho raha hai. Okay, it could be drought ho chuka hai, but net, okay, what is it? That basically means ki not forest ecology. Okay, possibly agri-labor to a great extent. Okay, in terms of cultural adaptability, what would it be? So if I take cultural adaptability, let's say ki food prior used to be for hunting and gathering tribes ke liye what? Hunt and gather, right? Hunt animals. Okay, yahan pe fruits, tuber, and so on and so forth. What has happened today, because they don't have access to the forests anymore, matlab it is illegal, what has happened is that now and Irulas are basically known for this. You've seen this in recent movies and they have shown it, right? Everybody knows about this, right? So in order to make up for the lack of protein, okay, in fact, they have a practice of, okay, rats, okay, for protein. So where they work, right, especially in agricultural, in farmland, right, so you have a lot of this, rats and rodents that are available, munching on, fresh grains, and they become nice fat, right? And so they are supposed to catch them, and not only do they catch them, they take them home, okay, because of the lack of availability of ability to hunt, and neither do they have the money to be able to buy any kind of protein in order for their survival to have protein, okay, so they have sort of like picked up this kind of a habit. Now it's basically changing to a great extent, but of course, something I'm saying, it used to be there at some point. In terms of biological, what could you bring in terms of biological adaptability with regard to the change from the political economy of hunting and gathering in the forest to, let's say, some wage labor, right? What could it be? So for instance, let's say, okay, so it could be an example. For instance, let's say sickle cell, okay, so sickle cell anemia, okay. Now this used to be an advantage, right? Okay, for HPB gene, okay, let's say capital S and small s used to be an advantage. But today what you have, okay, now neither are they in Western Nilgiris, that is a malarial sort of infested region, right? So now they are in other sort of places, but now, that small s is basically giving them trouble because it is not something that is giving them any sort of advantage, and then they're not in that sort of an environment. So basically now what has happened is that, there are studies showing, loss. Okay, so 30 to 37.8%, okay, according to studies, 1995. Okay, basically all provided, so I'm basically quoting the same thing. I'm just trying to use what you already know, right, without creating anything, right? So a question like this, it basically requires your patience. Okay, so the question is relatively easy. The only thing is that, it does not necessarily tell you very clearly ki matlab the demand of the question kya hai, right? Okay, what should be your subheadings? What exactly do you have to connect, right? So if you can break this down, let's see if we have addressed it. So how political economy is integrated with ecological, okay, and adaptability perspectives in biocultural anthropology. The one thing that I've not talked about is perspectives. So with regard to perspectives, biocultural synthesis, Paul Baker, right? You have biosociality, okay? That is going to be your Paul Rabinow, right? You have your Sherwood Washburn, you have your, cultural consonance, Dressler, you have your Franz Boas, right? Who basically also talks about, the cultural, environmental sort of components with regard to your bio. Perspectives to hai aapke paas. But at the end of the day, in order for you to be able to address the demand of the question, very, very simple. If you can take an example and connect all of these sort of elements and show, especially thoda sa extra depth, is, when you can show the past and the present. Right, so you're basically showing at one particular point and another particular point, connecting it, right? You can't have a better answer than that. But uske liye aapko karna kya hai? You've got to thoda sa aapko wait karna hai and understand what exactly is the question asking for. And if you address it in so kind of manner, have you addressed all the other parts? Right? Okay, so this one particular question did not require too much of knowledge from you. This is not something that basically requires a lot of memory and studying and mugging up and so on and so forth. This is a simple question of application. Okay, but they just want you to connect multiple things, right? So political, economic, ecological, adaptability, right? All of these things, bio-cultural, and that might have been one of the reasons why only 2 students that I've seen have actually taken this particular topic, and both are from foundation. Right? Foundation mein theek hai. I mean, you have a lot of volume of writing, so you feel ki, okay, theek hai, let me break this down and then go for it. But in terms of knowledge, okay, maybe some may, maybe if you're not taking it up and you only thought of, the hominid side and not the hominin side, so it's good, right? But the other 2 questions, I don't think there was any knowledge-related demand from you. Okay, it is basically, do you understand the question? Are you able to connect different things? So conceptual clarity test kar rahe hain, okay, and you should be able to sort of put in some sort of ideas, some sort of examples, some sort of scholars. And if you can do this, I think you will be in the top 1% in this particular question, right? So that is your second answer as well. Okay, second question block. And if you take a look at the next question, okay, so this is the third block. So what do we have here? So we have questions of, okay, how anthropologists assess the nutritional status of a community, discuss the significance of intersectionality of ecology, culture, social inequality in the study of nutritional anthropology. So this is a question that essentially is testing your biological nutritional anthropology, but is making you connected with social, cultural aspects. In fact, there is a lot of connect here, and we can take a look. Next question is about culture, integrated, close kind of system, right? Okay, so you have your social, cultural anthropology, a little bit of theories as well. Okay, chapter number 6 and so on. And then you have pedigree and genealogical analysis, which again, biological anthro at the same time. It also basically touches, the chapter number 8, research methods. Okay, so what would be a good sort of an approach to these kind of questions? In fact, this is a question that many of you guys have attempted, right? So I'm not sure if it is because you could not find another block that you didn't like, or because you just liked, nutritional anthropology. See, the knowledge aspect for this particular question is not necessarily that difficult, right? But scoring again top 1%, top 5% in these kind of questions means आपको सोचना पड़ेगा, right? And why am I saying this, right? So for instance, look at this particular question A, 4-page answer, and you have essentially how anthropologists assess the nutritional status of a community, discuss the significance of intersectionality of ecology, culture, and social inequality in the study of nutritional anthropology. So not only do you have to talk about nutritional anthropology, you've got to talk about ecology, culture, social inequality, you've got to talk about intersectionality of these factors, and so on and so forth, right? So let's see how to break this down. So how anthropologists assess the nutritional status of a community, right? So the first thing that essentially comes to your mind is your anthropometry, because technically nutritional anthropometry, but that is not it, okay? And definitely not it for it to be a 20 marker, right? So if there's a 20 marker and a part of it, you try to bring in more sort of dimensions. So what could be the ways in which you assess nutrition, right? So one way to assess nutrition, of course, it is anthropometry, which is going to be your NFHS, your data like your stunting, wasting, underweight, and so on and so forth. Apart from this, you could also essentially connect it to, maybe some biochemical tests, right? So for instance, hemoglobin anemia, right? Hemoglobin is basically, tested through some biochemical test. It could be urine test, blood test. Blood test generally is how it is essentially done. Right? It has to be like, more than 13, 14, milliliters per deciliter, or, for women, it has to be like, let's say 2 less, or if it's pregnant women, it has to be a little more because the demand is a little more, right? Jo bhi hai, numbers are not important, but you understand. So there is one more dimension that you could introduce for nutrition, that is going to be your biochemical. What other things you could do? You could basically connect it to your growth and development wala chapter, in which, you have your growth curves, velocity curves, right? Your distance curves and velocity curves. That could be another sort of factor that you could sort of bring in here. Apart from this, you can also bring in any sort of other dimension that you can think of. For instance, dietary surveys. Okay, dietary surveys essentially is about what proportion of that family ka food, okay, is from so and so, vegetables, fruits. For example, if you take a look at different sort of races in America, right? African Americans essentially have less milk and milk products in their dietary sort of proportion in comparison to, let's say, European population. Uske liye there are multiple reasons. Okay, it could be economic sort of factor, but it is not it. Okay, there are others as well. There is also biology, because African origin people, less amount of lactose tolerance in comparison to the other groups. It's a dietary surveys and so on, right? So essay you can bring in multiple ones. This would basically address the first part. How do anthropologists assess the nutritional status of a community? Okay, so these are the ones. Discuss the significance of intersectionality of ecology, culture, social inequality in the study of nutritional anthropology. In fact, this essentially is multiple parts. So if I can just bring in a color, okay, yeah, red is good. Okay, so what do we have to talk about? So this, isko thoda sa you have to take a look at it. So what you have to do is that yahan pe you have to address what is ecology. Okay, you've got to address culture. Okay, you've got to address social inequality. Okay, and these three not, so if ecology does not mean what you study in environment. Ecology vis-a-vis nutritional anthropology. This, okay, so independently you have to address this. Then you have to bring in the fourth one, okay, which is going to be intersectionality of these. Right? So essentially what you have is पहला ये subset है. इस subset के बाद you have to bring in intersectionality. Okay? And on top of intersectionality, then you go for the significance. Discussion of the significance. So the significance is going to be the component. So in order to be able to do justice to this particular question, what would be required? Okay. content, facts, ये सब is not a challenge because these topics. The only thing is that you've got to address it right. Okay, you've got to see that you're addressing every part of the question that is asked in the way. So the framing of the question is very important, as we say. Right? So if you've done this, okay, even एक point अगर आपने लिखा है which is relevant, okay, you would have done really well, exceptionally well. ठीक है? So this is that. So what would it be? So for instance, let's talk about ecology, right? So with regard to ecology, maybe I'll take another color. Okay, so what would be ecology? Right? So if you're talking about ecology, essentially we are talking in terms of, okay, it could be in terms of, let's say, key forests, okay, axis, okay, in case you're talking in terms of tribes. It could be, let's say, the climate, okay, it could be the hills, okay, it could be the soil, right, and these kind of components, right? So if I'm basically talking about, let's say, culture, okay, what are we talking about with regard to culture? Are we talking about, okay, first of all, culture is learned behavior. Okay, but in this particular question, as we say, with regard to your nutritional anthropology, then what would it be? So food related, maybe it is beliefs associated. Okay, the maybe taboos associated. Okay, rituals associated, and so on. Okay, it would be that, right? And then you have social inequality. Again, social inequality with regard to let's say with regard to food, inequality with regard to food. Okay, so you've got to sort of break this down. So what would be inequalities here, right? So the inequality could be in terms of, for instance, caste, right? It could be in terms of tribe. Okay, it could be in terms of, let's say, it could be even in gender. It's a long answer question. So depending upon how many, kitna khol pa rahe ho in terms of number of dimensions, right? So, so this is basically that, right? So this is individually addressing it, right? So, then you have to sort of be able to connect this, right? The best way to connect or to show intersectionality is to show, by taking an anthropological example. So agar iska ek anthropological example agar aap loge, so a good way to sort of take a look at intersectionality essentially is by taking an example. So you take an anthropological example, okay, just like the previous question, okay, anthropological example, okay, take a tribe like any tribe. So I'm going to take Baiga. Okay, so what do you have? So you have your ecology, right? You have your, what is the next one? Okay, so ecology was one, right? Culture and social inequality. So let's talk about culture. Okay, we'll talk about social inequality. Okay, in fact, you can even bring in, because it is vis-a-vis nutritional outcome. We'll do a little bit in detail so that you really get a feel for how to craft, right? Okay, so this exam has actually made you, this particular paper has essentially made you think, before you, it basically takes you a little bit of time to craft the best answer, right? So you're going to talk about in terms of ecology, you're going to take in, discuss culture, social inequality, nutritional outcome. In fact, a good way to do this thing is before and after, just like we did in the previous one, right? So this provides very strong analysis, very rich sort of analysis. So what happens with regard to ecology, right? So first thing with regard to ecology is essentially forest is the keyword, right? So they had access to the forest, right? So they were shifting cultivators, and at the same time they had hunting and gathering, but they had their own sort of rules for it, right? So what are the rules? Okay, so we'll talk about this. So this is essentially no access. Okay, so this is the main sort of a difference. Okay, okay, so land alienation, displacement, wage, labor, and so on and so forth. So in terms of culture, what exactly changes, right? So culture is also an important sort of component yahan pe, because, especially when you have societies that are hunting and gathering, and, so it tends to be a lot more sort of egalitarian. Okay, equal sort of division, there are multiple components you can bring in, but मान लो कि ये है. Okay, but what is happening, like, after deforestation or after losing access to the forest and so on, right? What happens here? Right, so you can actually see that there is a huge difference when it comes to the cultural, because they lose their ways of life. Okay, so there is cultural erosion. Okay, there is going to be loss of traditional ecological knowledge. And I'll give you an example here, right? So for instance, if it is like hunting and gathering society, right? So that means that they have clear rules ki when they can hunt, okay, what species they can hunt, right? So for instance, if it is a whole year, right, so they are going to hunt only during certain periods, and when it is like the breeding season, they don't hunt that particular animal, right? Similarly, they don't hunt pregnant females, they don't hunt little ones, so meaning it is more sustainable kind of things. But again, that sustainability वगैरह, all that is lost now, okay, because it's not there. अगर करोगे तो मतलब forest department, right? So that is that. In terms of social inequality, so what happens in terms of social inequality, right? Again, so there are many components that you can analyze in these aspects, right? So social inequality is मतलब egalitarian वगैरह था, right? So today you have मतलब dependence on PDS, okay, but previously how would it be? Okay, so they would be doing relatively well, okay, so they would be having a lot more sort of equality in sharing, okay, products of labor of their hunt or gather, okay, or shifting cultivation, right? All these kind of things, right? But today, what do you see? Okay, in comparison to the other sort of social groups, you see that these guys have actually been, now they are at the bottom. Okay, they are at the bottom. Why so? Because now dependence on PDS. Okay, so with regard to PDS, right? So all of these kind of aspects. In fact, here you could also bring those elements, right? You could just mention the same examples that I mentioned, right? So they have rules regarding hunting. So they had like taboos, okay, beliefs, right, and so on and so forth, right? And the nutritional outcomes, which one was better, right? So when you had a lot more dependence on, मतलब यहाँ पे more variety, more diversity, okay, and better outcomes. Okay, here today, less diversity. What is it? Okay, PDS dependence. And PDS dependence, and you guys know, right? So there is very little sort of micronutrients and so on and so forth. So now today we are having, despite the fact that you have all kinds of welfare programs, it doesn't really work that well. Right? So that is that. Okay, so this is that. So this way, what you have actually done is that you have taken the example, to talk about which one. You have talked about ecology, you have talked about culture, you've talked about social inequality, all with regard to nutrition, right? Then you've actually shown intersectionality. Intersectionality, you have to, the best way to show intersectionality is through taking an anthropological example, whichever one, right? It can be caste example also. Caste may you guys understand, right? So for instance, there are many studies that basically show that, in certain, the lower down you go in the hierarchy, okay, in those castes, there is less diversity. So meaning, if you do a dietary survey, the proportion of fruits and vegetables, as part of their diet basically comes down the further down you go. Right? So depending upon the example, but example is the strongest way to do it. Okay, and the richest analysis is by taking an example of before and after. Okay, and that is something that you can see. We are not done yet, right? In order for you to be able to completely address this particular question, you have to now talk about what is the significance of understanding this intersectionality, right? So the first thing about this intersectionality is that it actually shows कि, मतलब social inequality क्या है, right? And why does it occur? And how does it basically sort of manifest? That is the first thing. Second thing you basically understand, right? The second thing you would probably understand is that different sort of groups, okay, while they all have the worst sort of social indicators, nutritional indicators, there are multitude of different reasons for it, and that basically requires different solutions for it, right? So for instance, the bottom, the caste hierarchy mein, the bottom one, okay, it is because of a different reason. Tribe ka reason is basically a different reason. Right? Gender could be another sort of reason. We didn't go into it, but depending upon the examples that you have chosen to sort of like go into, there are different reasons. So the third one could be the fact that, it cannot be a one size fits all kind of a solution. So if you have your PDS, if you have your ICDS and these kind of programs, the success of it cannot just depend on ki kitna calories gaya ki and what is the proportion. You've got to bring in multiple different sort of aspects here to holistically understand ki problem kya hai. Right? Okay, so nutritional outcome is only one part. Okay, you also have to look at the input. Okay, and the input side mein aapko dekhna hai ki why is this the input. So this becomes a lot more richer analysis, and based on this, if measures are taken, then the nutritional outcomes being a lot better, or at least for us to understand ki the nutritional outcomes kyun badh nahi rahe hain despite the best efforts, you'll have much better knowledge, okay, through which we could probably improve. So anthropology ka contribution yahan pe is very much. So this is how you would analyze a question of this particular type. Is this clear? ठीक है, so this is that. So this is a very this is a question जहाँ पे you know most of it, but it really requires crafting skills. Crafting skills कैसे आता है? Okay, the more answer writing volume that you have, the better it is. Right? In conceptual clarity का अगर problem था, so that basically means कि आपका foundation थोड़ा सा strong करना है, right? Okay, so that is that. Like there is not something you cannot just study something and go and write this, right? Okay, it has to be extracted from different parts of your syllabus. Right? There's no other option around it, right? So nobody has basically studied this answer, right? But you have some knowledge. And the fact that you have to extract and you have to connect and you have to bring an example and then bring all of these things together, that becomes an important sort of a task in order to be able to deliver on this. Okay, that is that. Okay. The second question is basically critically examine the drawbacks of assuming culture as an integrated, closed system in understanding of contemporary society. Okay. So let's take a look at this. So basically critically examine, okay, the drawbacks in assuming that culture is an integrated closed system in understanding of contemporary society. Okay, so what do we have here? So one aspect is going to be the fact that you have to understand contemporary society. Okay, यहाँ पे integrated closed sort of a system, usko critically examine karna hai ki should we take a look at it. So first thing you've got to do, start. Right, okay, start taking a look at how do you basically introduce, right? So that means in case you have to sort of break it down like this, and let me see if I can discard this and start again. I guess not. Oops. Okay, let's leave that. Okay, so first thing is that what is integrated? See, if we are talking about integrated, one thing that you've got to understand with regard to integrated is kahan se aaya. Integrated essentially means what? Embedded. Right? Integrated essentially means embedded. Right? Integrated basically comes from that part of your syllabus, which is your functionalism. Right? So functionalism, structural functionalism, chapter number 6, right? Chapter number 6, subclause C, okay, which is your Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. They are the ones who basically say, it is an integrated whole. Right? It is an integrated whole. So that is how you should study it, right? So that means your marriage, family, kinship, customs, beliefs, taboos, rituals, religion, political, all these things are essentially like, linked. Okay. So that is how you should basically study it. Okay. So that is that. So uska history basically goes there. What about closed system? So open system and closed system, you've got to understand that if it is a closed system, essentially that means that you're studying the society by itself, right? Without looking at the influences that it has, right, from the external sort of world. So if I'm basically taking a look at what is, and if I can just write this down really quick, let's come back here. Okay, so if I'm saying integrated, okay, and I'm saying closed, right? So integrated is something that we just talked about, 6, okay, subclause C, मान लो. Okay, if I'm basically talking about it as closed, so we are basically saying it is a bound unit, okay, with little or no external influence, right? So why are we saying this? So this is your Malinowski, and this is going to be Radcliffe Brown, right? But you have to take a look at the context in which it was seen as an integrated closed system to analyze the society. Because when did this, both of them published their works? Argonauts of Western Pacific, 1922, more than 100 years, right? Structural functionalism, the Andaman Islanders, 1922, more than 100 years. The publishing is more than 100 years. The study has been more than that. So you understand this. So those days you have societies that are still on the verge of being connected to the rest of the world, okay, but not yet. So you can take a look at societies in a closed manner, still be able to study them inside out, and be able to produce something that is meaningful. But today's time period, 100 years hence, okay, can we say that we can study societies in a closed manner? Okay, it is going to be incorrect, right? So that is the main sort of an idea. So would you want to study everything integrated? Okay, do you want to study everything in a closed manner, right? So this is the question that they're asking you. So yahan pe kya hai? So if I go and just change the color here, right? So integrated mein, okay, if I have to do a critical examination, I'm basically looking at the positives and negatives. Positives and negatives are drawbacks of this particular system. But dekho ki isme positives kya honge. So positives is basically what? Okay, embedded is the way to go. Okay, it's the way to go. But sometimes you can also see that integrated study essentially means, so agar aap le rahe ho, right? So let's take a social system. So if you take a social system, okay, and if I'm basically taking a look at the village as social system, right? Of course, it's integrated, it's connected, right? That's the right way to study it, okay? But if you look at the outcomes of certain factors, okay, on different groups within that, okay, it is going to be different. So for instance, okay, outcomes, okay, for different parts are going to be different. Okay, so for instance, if I say if it's a dominant caste, okay, there is a welfare scheme and the roads are basically coming in, electricity is basically coming in, okay, but the village is basically connected by one system, that is your Jajmani system, in which everybody is interlinked, okay, socially, economically, ritually, and so on and so forth. Yes, it is true, okay, but you have to understand, okay, and let's say the lower caste. So yahan pe it becomes more important to study the breakdowns, right? So individually you have to study them, okay, that becomes very important. In fact, if that is not done, then we are minimizing or discounting the role of resistance, the role of conflict, okay, the role of individual agency, right, and so on. Okay, and if you want to basically connect it to theories and research methods, okay, from whose perspective are you studying? Right, okay, so these sort of things are basically there. Now, with regard to the closed system, what could be the benefit of studying something enclosed, and what is the benefit of studying something that is open? Okay, so today, generally we study things as open because, as Eric Wolf says, there is no society in the world that is not influenced by globalization, industrialization, urbanization, or at least culture contact, either directly, most societies, and some societies even indirectly. So a good way to basically go and study, okay, in today's, aapka final takeaway could be, it has to be nuanced. Okay, there is no one size fits all. Okay, but general approach is integrated study karo, okay, and open kind of study karo, right? So one, again, a good sort of an example here is going to be initially villages equals little republics. Okay, because there were very little sort of connection, but even that had to be revised, in the 1950s when we did the village studies. So rural cosmopolitanism. So this is what I mean by cosmopolitanism, okay, wherein you're studying it as an open system with, what are the influences with the outside villages. So this is basically what I mean by taking a look at a particular question and then trying to use the academic discipline of anthropology and the contribution of anthropologists in order to be able to study it. Are there contributions of anthropologists that we are taking in order to study this? Yes. Go back to your syllabus, see where exactly you can derive things that you can use in order to be able to craft an answer, right? You go here, again, try to see where exactly in your syllabus you'll be able to bring some good examples for your argument. Argument is essentially given by them. Integrated closed, in fact, integrated closed ideally should be taken together the way it is framed. But even if you break it down into two different parts and then explain, okay, that is also fine. But you have to understand ki kahan se aa raha hai, okay, what are the positives, what are the negatives, what are the positives, what are the negatives. Arguments are being given, but you have to find evidence of it in support for those arguments. Is that clear? So this would probably be a very well crafted answer, probably the top 1% kind of a score, right? So this is what is required here. The next question is, differentiate between pedigree and genealogical analyses, okay, and discuss the history and application of these methods in anthropological studies. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. So what exactly is pedigree, right? Pedigree essentially started with, not necessarily humans, right? Pedigree started when they were breeding, right? When they were breeding horses, and especially in Germany and Europe, where they were breeding dogs of different varieties, right? Okay, and then you had it in botany as well, okay, with regard to the different breeds of plants and so on. But with regard to animals, right? So they had like a very detailed sort of pedigrees that were kind of maintained so far as history is concerned. Okay, so generally the idea is that pedigree analysis is something that we do in biological anthropology, and genealogical sort of study is essentially your understanding kinship related patterns and so on and so forth. Today's time period, this is the final takeaway. You have to say that since anthropology is trying to integrate all of these, right? So we are basically coming with similar symbols, okay, for your genealogy and your pedigree, especially when you have these Western author, recent sort of books. But India mein, whatever happens there, we'll take it a little later. So we are a little more traditional with regard to that. But that is the final sort of takeaway. So with regard to applications, what would it be? Okay, so history mein na, so we talked about history of pedigree. Okay, what about history of genealogy? So genealogy basically again goes back to W.H.R. Rivers, right? Okay, so W.H.R. Rivers, A.C. Haddon, Seligman, the Torres Straits expedition, the Melanesian sort of islands, right? And in 1898. right? So in fact, WHR Rivers was not supposed to go for it. In fact, he was saying ki nahi, who's going to go there and kya karenge, I'm so that is that period, right? This is before your Malinowski armchair and so on. And then he realized ki his students were basically getting an opportunity to go and do some great studies, and then he realized ki AC Haddon is going to be there, Seligman is going to be there, they are also going FOMO. Okay, let me go and study. And then once he reached there, he was ill. He landed there. I don't know if you guys know this kind of story, but then he was taken good care of by the locals. Then he's very happy. Then he starts doing some color blindness ka study he was doing, right? And then he's like, acha, aapke paas wo color blindness ka issue hai. Okay, who else is there in your home and you're close by? Acha, wo kaun hai aapke rishte mein, and so on and so forth. And then he starts realizing that the terminologies that are used, okay, you don't have a very direct sort of a translation for it. Okay, so brother hai ki cousin hai? Brother, cousin, sub same. So this confusion. So basically what is happening, so let me draw it, okay, and then try to understand it better. Okay, that was the beginning of your genealogy. So if somebody has written WHR Rivers in 1906 and told us, okay, that is not the right one. Okay, it basically goes even back to your Torres Straits Expedition 1898, right? So this is fairly straightforward, right? So they're asking you, what is it? What is this? Okay, what is the history? What is the history of that? Okay, what are the applications with regard to your anthropology, right? So kinship studies, what all the kind of things that you can understand, what kind of marriages would be there, what kind of inheritance patterns would be there, what are the kinship terminologies, Omaha, Iroquois, Dravidian sort of kinships, whatever it is, right? So you bring that pedigree, single mutation sort of diseases, anything that basically follows Mendelian sort of patterns can be sort of studied through pedigree, right? Uska, a lot of importance is basically given today because genetic screening, counseling, these kind of aspects, right? So fairly straightforward answer, okay? Fairly, crafting may, it is going to basically test you, right? So that is that. So the next question block is question number 4. So anthropology provides a multidimensional understanding of human beings by bridging the gap between science and humanities. Elucidate. Okay, so this is a very typical kind of a question, right? So you guys have practiced this quite a bit. You have the next question, which is from your fossils module. Okay, so that is going to be Mousterian tool tradition, archaeofossils, right? So Mousterian culture and its makers, specifically asking about the makers as well. And the last one is critically examine James Fraser's theory of evolutionism and elucidate the place of religion in today's time period, right? So I think it's an interesting block. Seemed like an easier block in terms of total thinking in comparison to the previous sort of block, because this is something that you've practiced multiple times, right? Okay, especially foundation students and even in both kiye humne, right? So test series, laws and all of that. Okay, so how would you address the first question? Anthropology provides a multi-dimensional understanding of human beings by bridging the gap between science and humanities. So multi-dimensional, but you should also basically say that, so multi-dimensional essentially means what? You're essentially saying that, yahan pe biologically, socially, culturally, historically, all these kind of things you want to sort of bring in. But the main chunk of this question essentially saying that it is a very good sort of a medium, it is a very good sort of a discipline that can bridge the gap between science and humanities. So that means you've got to say that it's a scientific discipline. Okay, so you have to bring in the scientific sort of dimension here. So what is scientific dimension and what is the humanities dimension? Again, it is disciplines, right? A group of disciplines that is basically science means what? Objective, study of natural laws. Humanities basically means what? It is a little more objective. Sorry, humanities actually means it is subjective. It's more about interpretation and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so that is that. So what will be the scientific dimension here? So in case I'm talking about scientific dimension, I'm bringing in biological anthropology. I'm trying to bring in physical anthropology, right? Applied genetics. You're talking about evolutionary biology. You're trying to bring, agar aap evolution padh rahe ho, you have to bring in ideas of let's say ki, your gene flow, your mutation, your genetic recombination, right? All of these things are essentially the bio dimension here, right? The scientific dimension here, right? Objective, right? Natural laws, biology, natural science. You have other sort of fields as well, archaeology, archaeological anthropology, right? So in case you have to do it, you have to basically use scientific methods like stratigraphy. You're going to be using scientific methods like carbon dating, isotopic analysis and other kind of things as well. So these things also, agar Harappa padna hai, to you have to study it in a scientific sort of a manner in today's time period. But anthropology also, not only social cultural anthropology, but social cultural anthropology, your linguistic anthropology, a lot of your paper too, is not necessarily, objective study of natural laws, right? Society ko study karna is basically a little more humanities. And when I say humanities, what do we mean by it, right? Humanities essentially means that it is more about interpretation, right? It's about meanings and values and something jahan pe wo quantify karke padna thoda mushkil hai. But still anthropology tries to do it. right? It basically tries to study it using scientific or quantitative qualitative methods with certain degree of rules, understanding the limitations, using triangulation and so on and so forth. So agar socio-cultural anthropology hame padna hai, so let's say ki, within humanities, let's say ki socio-cultural anthropology, which is basically religion and politics and kinship and rituals, right? It is about interpretation. It is about using emic methods. It is about using insider's perspective, right? It is about using, the ideas like your, thick description, right? So that is that, right? So language is basically, what would folklore mean to them? Why is religion sort of universal, right? What is, cultural evolution all about, right? So these things are humanities. So how does it essentially sort of integrate science and humanities? It integrates science and humanities, even in the previous topic that we discussed it, you could bring in perspectives like your Paul Rabinow, you can bring in Paul Baker, biocultural synthesis, you could bring in biosociality, right? You have your Sherwood Washburn, you have Franz Boas, you have Dressler, cultural consonants. There are multiple things, right? You could also take examples here to say how they are essentially, how it basically bridges the gap. So for instance, if I take the example of medical anthropology, I have medicine, scientific field, okay? At the same time, you have the social concept of disease, which is the social side, right? If I'm basically studying biocultural adaptation, I'm studying Tibetans and their high altitude adaptation, PAS1 gene science, okay? At the same time, I'm also taking a look at their cultural habits, how they, the cultural aspects of how they, manage to prevent polycythemia, for instance, right? So that is that. Forensic, again, application of science to sort of deal with legal problems, social problems of society, right? Environmental anthropology, understanding environment could be science, but understanding how does that essentially sort of, environmental determinism, like how does it basically influence different cultures, different sort of trajectories, again, that is social, right? So you have both, right? So you're going to have the humanities angle, at the same time scientific dimension, and anthropology is one of those fields that basically tries to bring both of them to provide a more richer analysis. Agar aapne ye likh liya, okay, as a 20 marker, okay, it is the best answer possible, right? Okay, so again, that is basically what you had to do. I think many of you would have chosen this, right? So that is that. What about question number 2? Okay, question number 2, or 4B, is Mousterian tool tradition. Write a note, so relatively simple. Okay, so Mousterian tool tradition, and then Mousterian culture and its makers, right? So essentially, you have to talk a lot about your Middle Paleolithic. So what do you have in Middle Paleolithic, right? What do you have in Middle Paleolithic? Okay, so in Middle Paleolithic, see, Mousterian basically means that you bring in the Lu Moustier, right? So it is a Middle Paleolithic, 300,000 years ago, 400,000, all the way till 40,000 years ago, right? It is associated mainly with Neanderthals, okay? But, you had the early, the hominins as well, right? Okay, so they have also been known to use them, right? The kind of tool tradition is going to be Levallois tool tradition. So if it is about Levallois tool tradition, then you want to bring that sort of a diagram. Then you basically bring in the tool types as well. The tool types are going to be your your scrapers, your points, your borers, your denticulates, right? So you bring in all these kind of things. At the same time, you also have your previous sort of tools tradition that kind of exists, right? Okay, so core, say you're moving to flake, right? So that is that. So Mousterian culture is a second part of this. Mousterian culture essentially becomes you have to introduce your Neanderthals and write about everything that you have studied about Neanderthal culture, right? So it is not only about the tool tradition, it is about what was their subsistence, okay, big game hunting, okay, mammoths and bison and it was colder climate, reindeer, right? Okay, and along with it, they would supplement it with some plant foods as well, right? So, what about fire? Would they have been fire, right? Would they have been any sort of dwelling, settlement sort of patterns or settlement sort of structure? For instance, you have this open caves or, those kind of systems, whether it is about clothing, whether it is about religion, whether they had the ability to speak, right? Okay, so of course you have FOXP2 gene, but what do scholars say whether they had similar sort of a language ability just like us? Okay, just like the human species. What is the debate regarding those? So all of those aspects had to be brought in with regard to the Mousterian culture. It also asks you about Neanderthals, the makers of this particular tradition, right? So while you might have had early hominins, right, you also have this key Mousterian makers are essentially your Neanderthals. So this is a fossils ka question as well. So what would you write? Okay, what you would essentially write here is, you want to basically talk about the physical characteristics. You want to basically write about the cultural sort of characteristics, which already is covered, right? You would also want to talk about the phylogeny. Where exactly do they fit with regard to, you know, the human evolution, right? So you write about the fact that they have much larger sort of cranial capacity. You know, what was their average height? They were more robust, and so on and so forth, right? But you also have to bring in key. You cannot write about the Neanderthals and not talk about where do they fit in with regard to the human evolutionary sort of branches, right? So you then bring in ki, there are multiple sort of hypotheses, but you bring in Svante Pabo, who basically received the Nobel Prize with regard to medical science, right? So Neanderthal genomics, right? So 1 to 4% of the genome of present day populations of all humans that are non-African humans are basically derived from Neanderthals, right? So there has been interbreeding with the Neanderthals to a great extent, especially 60,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, and so on. And eventually, you know, there is a little bit of Neanderthals that lives through us, right? So what we had said, this is a separate sort of a species, separate sort of a line, and that, you know, ends with a dead end is something that is not necessarily accepted today. And this is the current understanding of the phylogeny, or the current acceptance of the phylogeny in today's time period, right? And then you basically talk about takeaway de do, acha sa conclusion de do, right? So it is not that, you know, Neanderthals are, you know, how we had initially introduced them, Homo stupidus, Ernst Haeckel, ऐसा नहीं है. They are not primitive brutes, right? You know, so we understand that they are just one of you know, other sort of humans, right? And they are part of the modern day makeup of the genetic makeup of the modern humans as well. So if you are able to bring all of these sort of elements, at least you can check off ki, all components of what the question is asking has been answered, right? Which particular dimensions of culture, yeah, which particular dimensions of the tools, theek hai, that's up to you. But, you know, this is something, the requirement is essentially is that you basically address all of these components, right? So that is that. The last part of this particular question is critically examine James Fraser's theory of evolutionism. In fact, this is one of the easiest questions that is possible. So who is James Fraser? Right, so Sir James Fraser, you know, is, you know, known for his classic work, the Golden Bough, right? 1890, a bunch of volumes, expanded later in 1915, and so on. The main sort of idea here is that he's trying to talk about the evolution of institution of marriage to religion to science, right? So this framework is basically what he brings about, and it's a landmark in the anthropology, you know, and that is that. So study of magic to religion, and religion to science is basically the evolutionary sequence, right? So that is his main idea. So what are the stages of development? So the stages of development essentially is that all societies, regardless of which society it is, they all basically progress in one unilinear sort of a sequence. Okay, he talks about magic being the first one, and uske bare mein he basically again talks about it. It can be contagious magic, it can be sympathetic magic. You know, magic is related to science in a particular way. It is the bastard sister of science for a reason. Okay, science basically is the right reason. The right sort of cause basically results in the right sort of consequence. Yahan pe it is basically the belief in the wrong sort of a reason for a particular outcome, for a particular sort of consequence. So he basically talks a lot about it. And then societies basically move to religion, then they basically move to science. This is the whole thing. Okay, now are there criticisms of this? Yes, 100%. There are a lot of criticisms. You could basically talk about it, but it is saying critically examine, right? So when you say critically examine, so that basically means that you have to examine what is good about it. Okay, what are the strengths of this idea, and what are exactly the limitations of this. So strength kya hai? So it is the pioneering work when it comes to religion, when it comes to rituals, when it comes to these kind of practices with regard to social evolution, right? Okay, lots and lots of comparative data has been collected in terms of mythology, in terms of ethnography, vis-a-vis folklore, you know, belief systems, myths, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, it later inspired many other sort of studies with regard to, you know, symbolic studies and religious studies and so on in later. These are all the positives. Negatives mein kya hai? Unilinear evolution, you know, overemphasis on primitive versus advanced, yeah, civilized, right? So very little sort of field work, or at least no direct sort of field work, secondary data, right? And the fact that you're saying that, you know, religion will eventually disappear, or magical practices will eventually disappear is something, you know, that is not seen in today's modern times. So for instance, the second part essentially is asking you to elucidate the place of religion in modernity. If he was right, okay, magic and religion should not exist. So societies that have become a lot more sort of advanced scientifically, right? So they should have basically dropped magic completely. They should have dropped religion as well, right? But is that true? contrary to what he had eventually thought, the conceptual part here about what exactly it is, right? You can bring in Durkheim and so on, right? But the main idea here is that contrary to what Fraser had thought, right, religion still remains influential even in today's most scientifically advanced societies. Right. Okay. So in fact, a great example is going to be, in yesterday's, when you had to go to your exam, right, you performed rituals and prayed, right? So you're essentially, scientifically, that should not matter, but, even in modern period, right? So you do believe that there is a particular reason why, religion is kind of important. So meaning, you would visit a temple before you go to the exam. If somebody is ill, you would visit a temple or a church or something, and then you would basically go to hospitals. Christian hospitals, they will basically have Jesus there. If it's a Hindu sort of a temple, you'll have Ganesha there, right? So this is basically that. Okay, you have pilgrimage tourism, right? Bahut sare examples are there, right? So there are so many of these kind of examples jahan pe, you will see that, astrology apps, okay, online pujas, okay, television evangelism, conversion and so on and so forth. Yoga, although it's not religion wala this thing, but today you see it. So the secularization kind of a thesis that he had basically proposed does not hold anymore, right? Secularization does not mean ki, religion will basically decline and it is going to be all science. That did not hold true today, right? So you're still seeing magical, religious, continuum, okay, along with science as well. Right? So, it was a little bit of a oversimplification when it comes to religion, right? I hope that is what you guys had also addressed here. If you have basically touched upon this with a little bit of specifics for each of these parts, okay, that is going to be an answer jahan pe you will be able to impress your evaluator. Is this clear? I hope it is. This is going to be something that is like compulsory. Right? So the general sort of feedback that I got from students is that paper 1 mein thode se you had questions jahan pe you had to create an answer, right? And I'm guessing that those must have been in these kind of questions as well, right? Your mandatory kind of questions, right? So you have questions that are about multi-species, multi-sided critical ethnography, probably something that you have not written before, right? Okay, and fetal origin of adult diseases and contribution of David Barker. Okay, so I guess these three I think are fairly okay. If you know it, you know it. If you don't know it, you don't know it. But we have done all of these. Okay, let's take a look at this particular question. So how do you basically create an answer here? So multi-species, multi-sided critical ethnography. This is interesting because most of our students basically attempt 5. Fifth question is basically the last set of questions, right? So, you're basically pressed for time. At the same time, you have a couple of questions jahan pe it requires a little more time to think and create something in order to craft good answers. So how would you address this question, right? So essentially the word ka meanings is something that you already know, right? The only thing is that you have to create something out of it. So what would we say ki multi-species? There's the first one, right? So multi-species, right? So if you just think about it, you know what is exactly ethnography. Ethnography is basically trying to study the human societies, right? But if it is multi-species, it means you're not just studying humans together, humans by themselves, but you're basically trying to study humans along with other species. So that means your plants and animals and whatever else that basically is part of that society. See, why is this kind of possibly be important, right? It could possibly be important, for instance, in case I'm studying, like, let's say the Toda society, right? Okay, if I'm basically studying the Toda societies, you have got to study it along with their buffaloes, right? They are very, very important. If I'm basically studying the Gond societies, I have to study the Gond societies in with regard to their relationship with the Sarrthis, right? So that becomes very, very important. If I'm basically studying, let's say, the Katunaikans, I have got to bring in this entire set of the honeybees and all those sort of elements as well. So essentially this is this is basically becoming a little more inclusive, jahan pe you have human and non-human ties that are being studied along with their ethnography, meaning aap unka livelihood bhi dekh rahe ho, right? Unka entire society mein dekh rahe ho. So that basically requires the inclusion of other species as well. That is how you would basically write this, right? So helps us see society more as an ecological web, right? Not just as purely a human domain nahi hai. Okay, it is the Todas with their buffaloes, right? So that is that. Multi-sited. See, multi-sited, again, it's not something that you don't understand ki meaning kya hai yahan pe. You know ki multi kya hai, site kya hai, ethnography kya hai. So that basically means field work has to be carried out in more than just one particular location. as opposed to, the traditional sort of ethnographies, jahan pe you go to a particular place, this is basically your people, this is basically the things, this is the, the rituals and whatever that basically happens in that place. See, today there is a lot more sort of importance of cultures being, transmitted in different places, right? Okay, so they are basically transmitted to different sort of places. So in case you want to study the, let's say ki Assam tea tribes, right? Assam tea tribes ka history basically goes all the way back to Jharkhand. Right, so you've got to study it in that manner. You're studying, let's say, a migrant society, let's say, migrant laborers from Jharkhand, from their home villages, right? So you basically have to also study them at the brick kilns of of Northwest India, near Delhi, and so on and so forth. You would have this. So essentially, you're not only taking a look at one particular group in one particular place, multi-sited. So essentially, you're basically trying to cover their mobility. You're trying to study their migration. You're trying to study their connections to other sort of places. You're going to try to study key cultural change, more than just the traditional ethnographies of your 1800s and early 1900s and mid 1900s, right? So that is something that you could bring in here. What about critical ethnography? So critical ethnography, essentially, again, the meaning of it, right? So it again goes beyond traditional sort of ethnography, wherein you're describing culture and different aspects of culture. You have to be asking questions about who has the power, right? What about the inequalities in this particular society? Okay, voicing opinions for them, right? This becomes a little more of post-colonialism, right? So you're critically questioning maybe injustice, you're questioning the need for change, right? So for instance, let's say you're basically trying to study a tribal society, but you're also trying to critique other aspects, right? The role of the state, the role of, let's say, mining and industries and dams and so on. Okay, where exactly does development go, right? So you're basically trying to take a look at a particular society. Okay, the role of the state, the role of industries, the role of corporates, right? And also basically looking at it through a critical angle. Okay, power, inequality, these sort of elements, right? So that is that. So this becomes, this actually makes anthropology a lot more sort of, to use the words of in postmodernism, right? You're basically being reflexive, right? Okay, and not just neutral observer and writing in a descriptive sort of manner, right? So multi-species we are basically studying humans with other species. Multi-sited we are basically studying the culture, right? But also in different places where they migrate to. And if it is about critical, you're also basically questioning the power and inequality and these sort of angles that are being brought in as well, right? So this would be, I'm guessing this is what most of you might have written for this particular question, right? Based on, the breakup of the words, right? But of course, they want to challenge you, right? Okay, so they are like, show me. Okay, show me what else you could basically bring in here to make it relevant, right? So that is it. What about evolutionary significance of menopause? So menopause is something that is directly from your syllabus. Kya hai menopause? Menopause is basically the natural cessation of menstruation and fertility in a woman, and that basically occurs between 45 and 55 and 12 consecutive times. It basically does not occur. Then we can say that it has, menopause has basically taken place. Now, again, menopause, there's an evolutionary significance, right? So evolutionary significance you can actually bring in this, that it is essentially present in the human primate and not necessarily in the other sort of primates, right? And what could it be? So usko explain karne ke liye there are various theories that we have seen. Test we have basically covered it. What were they? We had basically covered grandmother's hypothesis, right? So that basically is Christian Hawkes, right? So she basically says that older women, menopause, once it occurs, it basically allows the older women to shift their energy from bearing children to helping, the next generation, meaning raising the grandchildren, right? So this basically increases the odds of survival of that particular society, right? How so? Because it increases the reproductive success, because it is not only about giving birth, okay, it is also in helping the person take care of the newly born. right? So that is that. So this is your grandmother's hypothesis. Along with it, you had mother's hypothesis, which essentially means that, as late pregnancy essentially results in the greater the maternal age, it can result in multiple problems and even safety health risk for the women, right? So high maternal mortality as you have later and later sort of pregnancies. So this basically allows for women to invest in existing children and stop these risky late age births, right? So that is that. Then you have another theory, which is basically like your reproductive conflict hypothesis, which essentially means that there should be less competition amongst human societies or human societies ke women of different generations, right? So mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, and so on and so forth. So by seizing ability to reproduce, the older women basically take up new roles, right? So this basically reduces the conflict between the different sort of generations. It increases the overall the fitness of that particular society, right? So that is that. Now, of course, you can take a look at the biological one as well, right? So within the biological, it's primarily a biological topic, but you can basically bring in the social angles that I basically brought in as well, right? So यहाँ पे you can also bring in that it is something that is seen in human societies. कुछ other societies may be here, but within primates it is basically in human societies. Okay, so this is fairly that kind of a question. Fission track dating and its applications, right? So this is basically a question about your absolute dating. So archaeology ka ek question hai. So this is basically that. So fission track, and its application. So how would you basically write about it? You would basically say absolute dating, and define absolute dating, bring in some scholars. Why do we need absolute dating? Why it is a lot better? And when would you, and what is fission track dating? Okay, so you would basically try to say what it is. Okay, it is uranium-238 atoms inside certain like minerals. Okay, they sometimes split or fission ho raha hai, and once that basically happens, then this essentially leaves tiny damages, damage lines, which essentially are called your tracks, which is essentially the track, right? So these tracks in that mineral ka crystal. So once that basically happens, then scientists will basically count the number of tracks, and by knowing kitna uranium is still present, scientists can essentially calculate how long these tracks have been forming, and this will basically give you a good idea about the age of that particular sample that you're trying to study, right? So that is essentially what happens. Now, where can it be applied? It can basically be applied to volcanic kind of minerals. It could be obsidian, glass, mica, feldspar, meteorites and lunar rocks and so on and so forth. So ये archaeology में use होता है, prehistoric sites में use होते हैं, geology में use हो सकता है, right? These kind of things. So it works for those kind of things that you want to study, which are much older. So for instance, 100,000 years is basically where the starting point that you can learn to study, and it goes to billions of years. So this is your fission track, right? So that is that. So prehistoric sites ke baare mein, so mention the applications as well, right? So that would be what it is. Okay, if you have done that, you have essentially addressed the main demand of this particular question. Mitochondrial DNA in human evolution, right? So you have nuclear DNA and you have DNA that is outside the nucleus, which is in the cytoplasm, which is the mitochondria. Okay, so the DNA that is found in the mitochondria, which kya hai wo? That is the cell's powerhouse, right? So this is different from your nuclear DNA, and this can also be studied. Okay, mitochondrial DNA is essentially mother se inherited, right? So it is maternally inherited. So the only way it basically gets passed is it gets passed from the mother to the child, and उसमें उतना कुछ difference नहीं होता है, it has very little sort of recombination. Okay, so that basically helps, right? Okay, so this can be useful for tracing lineages and so on and so forth, right? So iska with regard to human evolution, right? So okay, fine. So it basically helps you in tracing ancestry, right? Because mitochondrial DNA is basically inherited unchanged from the mothers. Very little sort of genetic recombination वगैरह, right? So this helps immensely in reconstructing these maternal lineages, right? Okay, and that is that. So मतलब there is this concept of this molecular clock. So यहाँ पे you could basically bring that angle here. You could basically take it to this mitochondrial Eve that we have studied, Rebecca Kahn ka study, Stone King, Wilson, right? So these kind of studies of mitochondrial DNA, it has basically suggested that humans basically share a common maternal ancestor that is called as the maternal Eve. This is not the earliest person, right? But this is the one, jiska lineage has been available for study, okay, unbroken. And she is believed to have lived in Africa, right? Somewhere in Africa between 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. मतलब ये हमने बहुत बार किए हैं, right? So this study of hers, of theirs, okay, basically helps support the recent African origin, Rao, okay, of Chris Stringer, out of Africa sort of theory, right? So these are different models of human evolution, right? So you could bring these kind of things, right? So that is that. And मतलब ये mitochondria and uska variation can also be studied in order to understand the migration patterns, right? So Africa to Asia, Asia to Europe, okay, Asia to Australia, मतलब you get the picture, right? And from Europe to Americas, right? So Native American haplogroups have been traced all the way to northeast Siberian part, right? Northeast of Asia. All these things have actually been done, right? There are also ways in which, with regard to human evolution, you can do cross comparative study of the mitochondrial DNA between the humans and the Neanderthal, which has been done, by the way, okay, and the Denisovans. Right, so मतलब यहाँ से also you can actually get a lot of information regarding our similarities, our dissimilarities, and so on and so forth, right? So मतलब lots and lots of use of mitochondrial DNA in order to have a good understanding about human evolution. ठीक है, so if you can do this, मतलब 10 markers में इतना आप लिख नहीं पाओगे, but the more dimensions you can bring in, the more sort of specifics that you have. Since you have studied it, you should have, had the chance to bring it. And if you had, then, you would be in a very, very good state. Fetal origin of adult disease and contribution of David Barker. So this is the question for most of my students who have written this at the very end. So again, this is something that you don't know. Okay, but in case you have to understand fetal origin, okay, of adult diseases, right? So that basically means as an adult, what could be the diseases and why is it in the fetus, right? So that is that, and contribution of David Barker. So मान लो कि I'm assuming that you don't know who exactly is David Barker. Okay, David Barker was a British epidemiologist. He proposed this idea in 30-40 years ago, and basically what he was doing is that he's trying to study the birth and death records, and what he has noticed is that there is a correlation. Okay, when you basically do a correlation kind of a study, you realize that when there is a low birth weight ka baby, which is because of nutrition ka unavailability, okay, malnutrition hai maan lo, okay, undernutrition hai, this basically results in low weight of that baby, and this low weight of baby basically shows up in terms of its impact much later in life. So they have a higher sort of correlation with coronary heart disease. It basically has a lot of relevance to your hypertension, okay, which is blood pressure, okay. It basically has a lot of relevance to your type 2 diabetes, okay, not the genetically born wala thing, but type 2 later in life, okay. It basically has a lot of relevance to like stroke and so on and so forth. So what he essentially concluded is that there is a lot of adult disease to a great in a great way is basically caused, okay, way back in the day, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, in the mother's fetus. And that again goes back to the kind of nutritional practices, okay, of that. So poor fetal nutrition during those 9 months can actually result in altered development of that baby, okay, altered metabolism of that particular baby. And this can have long-term health-related vulnerability. Right, so this is basically that. So net मतलब यहाँ का idea ये है कि nutritional stress in the womb basically forces the fetus to adapt using things like your thrifty phenotype, okay, the thrifty genotype. So this kind of programming basically helps in survival because there is less amount of food in the short term, but it basically increases the adult disease risk to a great extent, especially when you start living again in calorie-rich sort of an environment or normal sort of an environment. Right, it can again cause epigenetic changes and all of these kind of things, but we don't have to go that in depth. In fact, if you guys remember, we've talked about this, I believe. Okay, the Dutch, the hunger winter, right? So in time periods, when the babies during the babies inside the womb and outside in the young age, okay, if they were basically exposed to famine, they had to sort of endure famine. That again, let me repeat this again. Okay, when the babies are basically in utero, okay, and there is a famine, मान लो, Okay, so there is a higher rate of diabetes and obesity and stroke and blood pressure and all these kind of things, right? So NCD kind of disease. Okay, so it basically goes back to, what was the situation when they were inside the mother's belly, right? So very interesting sort of a study. But of course, you have to infer all of these things from here and be able to say that inka ek study hai and so on and so forth. That is not going to be possible. But in case you have written fetal origin, right? So fetus may, these are the kind of reasons, if you were able to sort of bring a couple of reasons for it, and this has resulted in so and so kind of disease, anything relevant to this thing is going to be something that can fetch you some marks. But this is not going to be the reason why somebody is scoring 150 and somebody is scoring 100. Right? No chance at all, right? 160, agar man lo ki the high score is 160 approximately, it is not because of these kind of bouncer kind of questions. It is because of those 35 pages jahan pe everybody is writing their best, right? These 15, more or less everybody is going to be in the similar sort of boat. Is that clear? I hope so. Okay, so this is that. Another set. Okay, what are genetic markers? Discuss the applications in understanding population variation. In fact, this is a narrow question. It's not as broad as you think, because they want you to tell the applications with regard to a subheading called population variation. Okay, in terms of disease association and forensics. Right. So literally they are telling you कि मतलब मुझे क्या चाहिए इन subheadings के अंदर लिखो. Right. And this is a 20 marker, which is fine. Okay, I think this is a question in which you can do it. So what exactly is a genetic marker? Genetic markers are basically these identifiable DNA sequences or maybe some sort of protein variants that show heritable sort of differences between individuals, between different kind of groups, different kind of populations, right, and so on, right? So this is that, right? So they can actually be detected using different levels, right? So genetic markers can be of 3 different types. Okay, one could be your serological kind of markers, one could be your biochemical kind of markers, one could be molecular markers. This is basically what we have done, right? So test series vagara mein, and laws, these kind of projects may we have essentially done this, right? So you can basically break it into these 3 categories. If it's serological, again, you can bring in your ABO, you can bring in your RH, you can bring in your, these are some good examples, right? So this is basically based on your antigen antibody kind of reactions, okay, with regard to blood, right? Specifically your chapter number 9.6 se aap nikal sakte ho. ABO blood groups kya hai? So Karl Landsteiner, right? So 1900, 1901, right? At that particular time period, different sort of populations, variations, and so on and so forth, right? RH, you have your data, we have done this multiple times, right? RH is basically the presence of this D antigen. Okay, so in certain populations, for instance, the Native American population, RH is mostly positive. Okay, there is presence of it. Okay, 99%, right? In Indian population, South Asian population, I should say, India, Pakistan, Nepal, these kind of countries, how many, right? So it is between 92 to 95%, right? So you have that. When it comes to countries like your Basques, okay, which is in your Spain, France kind of border, Irish and so on, wahan pe RH negative is a lot more. 60 to 65% is basically your RH positive. So that means 35% to possibly even 40% is this one. And that is the highest. These are all population variations, right? This is your RH, ABO and so on and so forth. Second is going to be kya hai? Okay, serological markers. Then you have your molecular markers. With regard to molecular markers, what is it? So we are basically going to talk about DNA, serological markers. Then we have biochemical markers. Okay. So biochemical markers, biochemical is essentially study of proteins, enzymes, right? So you can have these simple variants of these processes called electrophoresis. So different kind of things for different kind of proteins and enzymes. So hemoglobin variant is an example. Okay, so HBS, sickle cell, HBE, HBC, enzyme related polymorphisms ho sakte hain, G6PD deficiency ho sakta hai, right? PGM variants ho sakte hain, right? So these kind of examples you could bring in, right? So hemoglobin variant HBS is basically your 11P. Okay, wahan pe you have genetic markers that basically say whether it is going to be CTC or it is CAC. If it is CTC, that essentially results in glutamic acid. If it is CAC, if it is going to be resulting in valine, so that basically means that the final sort of amino acid that is going to be formed, okay, and the hemoglobin molecule that is going to be formed, is it going to be circular, right? Is it going to be sickle shaped, right? So these kind of things is going to be there. G6PD X-linked, right? So that is that. So you could basically bring in some of these examples, right? Then you have molecular sort of markers. So in molecular markers, you can have RFLPs, you have your VNTRs, you have your STRs. बहुत सारे methods are there. It really depends कि आपको learn like what exactly do you want to learn here. अगर forensics के लिए है तो वो code is your FBI का what is it? They have that kind of database with 13 different sort of sites. And today, I think from 2017, they've increased to 20 different sort of sites. Jhampe, you have to study it. And then, that basically is used to find out the individual identification, personal identification ke liye, right? You have it. Okay. In terms of disease ke liye, you could basically bring in, again, we talked about it already, but you could bring in BRCA1, you could bring in BRCA2, you could bring in your L11P, depending upon what exactly you want to go with, right? So you could basically bring in those. Right, so you could bring in your HLA markers with regard to your disease association, right? So spondylitis, ankylosing spondylitis, right? Many things that we have already done. All of these things directly wo pooch rahe, right? So that is that. In terms of forensics, आप क्या use करोगे, right? So forensics, we talked about it, CODIS and STRs and VNTRs previously, and so on and so forth. Disaster related, accident site, criminal scene analysis, paternity diagnosis, everything from your syllabus you can just bring it in. The only thing is that they want you to write it in the structure in which they have asked you to write. Okay, the agenda of biological anthropology became more scientific to the from the middle of the 20th century, and justify. So this is also a good question, right? So this is basically the evolution of biological anthro, right? That's it. So biological anthro kya hai? It is basically earlier known as physical anthropology, then it became new physical anthropology, right? So 19th century mein it basically began as physical anthropology, and the main focus was racial typologies. Okay, anthropometry, cranial, ye sab padh ke, essentially you're going to be doing a very descriptive sort of a job, jahan pe you're going to sort of say ki, based on so and so kind of factor, this is the racial sort of a typology. But then what happened? Okay, it has become more scientific from the middle of the 20th century, 1950s onwards. Okay, so you get this. So it's becoming more scientific, it's becoming more problem oriented, it is becoming, it's basically using a lot more evolutionary sort of approach. It is integrating genetics, molecular biology, modern scientific methods, right? So that is that. See, the earlier phase, agar aap dekhoge, which is the middle of the 20th century. So pre-middle of the 20th century, essentially you have to write that, it is based on racial classification. You have your Risley in India. You had that Carlton Kuhn, right? Which basically is about the scientific racism. They heavily relied on these anthropometric methods, craniometry, anthropometry, even serology to just classify and differentiate people. But you also have to understand that they had colonial ideologies to say that this is more advanced, this is less advanced. Carlton Kuhn said what? Okay, that the whites, essentially, we are all from the same sort of ancestral stock, but we have evolved quicker, sooner, and further. So we are a little advanced when it comes to evolutionary scales, right? So that is that. But from the mid-20th century, you're seeing a shift. What is that shift? So modern evolutionary synthesis. Evolution, agar aap dekh rahe ho, you're basically sort of taking your Lamarck and then, Darwinian thing, and then after that Mendel, and after that, population genetics. You have your T.G. Tons, okay, which is the genetical theory of natural selection. Fisher, you have Dobzhansky, and he basically writes the genetics and the origin of species. What is it? 1937 something, right? Well, dates dekh lo. Okay, so anthropology basically adopted different sort of fields, population genetics, advanced genetics, scientific methods, right? So instead of these racial typologies, right? So that is that. So that is one thing. In terms of technology and its advances, you could basically mention ki abhi to, just like what we just talked about. Okay, biochemical methods have been introduced, molecular sort of markers have been introduced. Okay, HBS we understand protein electrophoresis. We have G6PD the main idea behind it, and why it occurs, and how it occurs, and how to test it, right? So these are all basically replacing these crude race categories ka study, right? What do? I am going to study based on so and so factor, based on nose. I'm going to study based on cranial, and so on and so forth. So this is my classification of race. This is your classification of race. But all of those things are essentially, just racial classification linked to colonial ideologies, right? But today, though, you think about this. DNA sequencing hai, mitochondrial DNA studies are there. Okay, ancient DNA, Svante Pabo. If you just think about all the things that we just talked about, all of these things are basically advances. All of these things are essentially revolutionized, human evolutionary studies, okay, human origin sort of studies, right? It has become a lot more sort of problem oriented. There's a lot more sort of research talking about, ki measuring skulls ka emphasis nahi hai abhi. It is more about, what is adaptation, like biocultural adaptation, biological adaptation, high altitude adaptation, cold adaptation, heat adaptation, right? Sherwood Washburn basically says in 1951 that now physical anthropology, say we have to basically go to new physical anthropology, wherein we basically just let go of this hangover of this racial categorization with, who's more advanced and who's less advanced, right? So now you're going to focus on, since I'm talking about Sherwood Washburn, I'm going to say you're going to study your primates, you're going to study your fossils, you're going to study genetics vis-a-vis them, in order to just explain human evolution a lot more scientific sort of a manner. Okay? After that, iske baad you also have, with regard to, again, what else can we bring in? We can actually bring in health and disease. Well, you can take the same sort of categorization of population variation, disease, forensics, and so on, right? So, yahan pe kya hoga? So, let's say if I'm talking about health and disease, again, you can bring in your sickle cell trait, right? And it's interlinking with malaria, right? So, Anthony Allison, 1954, right? So, he basically talks about the correlation between sickle cell alleles and the geography with malaria, right? So, basically, you're linking the genes with environment, advanced sort of studies, right? You're starting to see the emergence of medical anthropology, human adaptability, epidemiology. You understand, right? So within biological anthropology, there are so many other things that basically come up, more than just the racial classification. So in contemporary biological anthropology, we have genomics, we have isotope analysis, we have ancient DNA, we have many of these things to answer evolutionary questions, to study humans in a more multidisciplinary kind of a manner, right? You are integrating archaeology, ecology, medicine, genetics. What else did we do, right? Health, disease, so many things you're able to sort of bring in. So focuses on studying population variation, adaptation, human evolution, forensic anthropology, rather than the age-old racial categorization, classification, linked to these colonial ideologies or superiority, inferiority, and so on, right? So that is that. Right. So I think this is a fairly straightforward question, but this you will be able to score if you have been able to address the demand of the question. If you have written this wala part and been able to sort of bring in the specifics, great. But if you have not been able to mention ki racial typologies was the initial sort of a study, and then the move to new physical anthropology, Sherwood Washburn, 1951, right, and more biological, at least this part should be there. Ki what has become more advanced today. If you've basically talked about the early sort of evolutionary ideas and which is not very scientific, and then later moving to, integrating many different kind of ideas, then you're still right? But that racial categories is basically the main sort of essence. Right? So that should have also been there. Describe briefly the theoretical sort of perspectives in linguistic anthropology to explain the relationship between culture, language, and thought. In fact, the same sort of question had been given to you, right? I had basically given it as culture, language, and cognition. Exact same. Okay. Instead of cognition, it is about thought. So what is it? Okay. So essentially, this is introduce what exactly is linguistic anthropology. It basically studies language and culture and thought, and all of these things are essentially related, and different sort of theoretical perspectives have been used to explain the relation between this, and this. Right? Okay. So for instance, the most important one here is linguistic determinism or relativity. Okay. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Right? So you basically have the strong version determinism that language, determines the thought. Okay. The other one is going to be language basically influences the thought pattern. Right? So two different things. And you have examples. Hopi basically think of time as cyclical, as opposed to us. We think of it more in linear terms. Right? Eskimos basically have more sort of words for certain things, like multiple words for snow in comparison to what you and I would have, because we have very little snow in our world, right? Of course, then you could basically bring in the criticism to this, right? So the most important criticism here is the universalist perspective of Noam Chomsky. So Noam Chomsky essentially mentions that all humans essentially have very similar innate linguistic structures overall. Okay, language might be different, but the linguistic structures are relatively similar. Okay, so that means the thought is not fully restricted or constrained by the different sort of languages. Okay, so basically he's kind of criticizing that kind of perspective, right? So you could basically bring that element, and then you can bring in a couple of examples, right? Okay, whatever example is there, this is exactly about the Sapir-Whorf. So all the kind of examples you could bring in. You could also bring in this critical angles. Okay, what could be the critical sort of things, the limitations, right? Okay, so the limitations essentially is going to be that you can bring in some perspectives. For instance, Pierre Bourdieu basically brings in linguistic capital. Language is tied to power. Language is tied to status. Language is tied to what is considered as legitimate in that particular society. You could bring in Michael Foucault. Okay, Foucault, right? Okay, so he's basically saying that it is a system of power and it is a system of knowledge and so on, right? You could bring in examples like there is a hierarchy between languages as well. Like for instance, Sanskrit versus vernaculars, English versus vernaculars. Again, depends on the kind of setting, right? So language choice basically is also related to the social hierarchy and so on and so forth. So all these things essentially could be brought into the ambit of this particular answer, right? So you would conclude with a simple sort of a takeaway: the relationship between culture, language, and thought, okay, is best understood not in isolation, but as a strong relationship, okay, a dynamic sort of an interaction, right? So from your Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, okay, of their relativity, right, which is more accepted, to other sort of perspectives that we just talked about, right? Linguistic anthropology can actually show how language both how language basically influences, how it basically shapes, our thought process, our worldviews, okay, and also our entire social structures are basically sort of influenced by it, right? So this is how you would basically answer this kind of a question. This is a fairly straightforward question. This one basically requires the main essence to be known, and this is again is fairly descriptive kind of an answer. I think you would have had content for this as well. So this would be your question number 7, and this is also another block that many of you guys have attempted. So I guess most of these things, in fact, cultural reproduction is something that we had again done. Okay, so we have done it, we have discussed it. I remember that clearly, major theories in support of origin of food production. Okay, so that is also something that we have seen and written, discuss the centrality of African continent in narrative of human evolution. Okay, and I'll talk about this a little later as well. I think anybody who has got conceptual clarity with regard to primates, fossils, and archaeology, right? So this particular topic, somebody strong, I think they would be able to really write a very strong answer, especially when it comes to analytical questions. Okay, anyway, more on that a little later. Okay, so let's talk about this particular question. In fact, let me just talk about B. Okay, the major theories proposed in support of origin of food production. Okay, so what are the theories you've got to write, and how did the change in subsistence economy how did it bring about revolution during this particular period? Meaning, in fact, like I had given you different sort of scholars and their perspectives, right? One is the revolution, one is evolution, balanced sort of perspectives and so on and so forth. So this is basically saying कि revolution के बारे में बताइए. So what are the theories? The major sort of theories you could basically say could be the Oasis theory of Gordon Childe, right? 1936, right? He basically says that there was climate change, and after the Ice Age, basically climate basically dried up, and many areas essentially became a lot more sort of open, right? So humans and animals and plants basically gathered around these kind of oases, right? So at this particular time period, when all of these guys come together, you're starting to your domestication is beginning, right? But of course, you have criticisms to all of these theories. Aapko likhna padega. Later evidence essentially showed that agriculture did not occur in these arid areas with these oases, but in very fertile areas, right? Like your Fertile Crescent, right? So that is that. Another sort of a theory is going to be the hilly flanks theory or the natural habitat hypothesis, Robert Braidwood, right? 1940s and 1950s, right? So agriculture essentially begins in the natural habitat of the wild ancestors of the same plants, whether it is your wheat, whether it is your barley, whether it is your oats, and then same thing for your animals as well, right? For your goats and sheep and so on and so forth. So it is in the hilly flanks of the fertile sort of areas, right? So people already familiar with these plants and animals gradually started domesticating them. A good example that he basically brings up is the Iraq mein Jarmo site, right? So that is that. Then again, you have your population pressure hypothesis. Lewis Binford is the biggest sort of proponent. Population growth ho raha hai, and the population growth essentially is increasing more than the resources are able to provide with their basic hunting and gathering and so on. So humans basically had to intensify some forms of production in order to be able to sort of feed themselves. Hence agriculture, hence farming basically picks up, right? So densely populated river valleys and all of that, especially when it comes to Nile and your Indus and all of that, is basically provided as a evidence for such a hypothesis. Okay, edge zone hypothesis, Lewis Binford, right? So meaning the ecological margins where the resources were scarcer, okay, and the population is basically there, that kept pushing the groups to sort of find ways to domesticate, find ways to use those plants and animals better, right? So that is that. There is a co-evolutionary sort of model, which is David Rindos, right? So that is going to be domestication was not a sudden sort of a process, but it was a long process in which both plants, animals, humans, like all of them basically are sort of evolving together. Okay, they're adapting together, right? So plants, animals, and humans. There's a feasting model, okay, which is your Brian Hayden, which essentially says that it is not for survival, but it is to throw big parties. It is for huge feasts, for big alliances, for social prestige, and so on. So उसके लिए मुझे कुछ extra लेके आना पड़ेगा. Hence, agriculture developed. Brian Hayden. Some theories and all are there. For instance, in South Asia, Mehergad, it is barley and wheat and cattle and all these kind of things basically picked up. In China, you had your millet and rice, and Mesoamerica, you had your squash, you had your beans, you had your maize, and wo regional variations hai. Okay, so that is that. So you can mention these kind of theories. The 15 marker, I'm not sure how many of these things will be able to put in. You also have to keep room for how the change in subsistence economy brought revolution. So why exactly is a revolution? Sedentism, say it essentially goes into from not being sedentary to becoming sedentary, right? So permanent villages, Jericho, Jarmo, Mehergad, okay, there is increase in population growth because of easy availability of food, okay, famine come ho raha hai because you have agriculture, you have constant supply, you have social stratification that basically comes in because, whenever you have enough food ka supply, and there is surplus, right, that surplus is basically going to result in other things. Somebody who's going to control it, somebody who's going to become specialized in craft, pottery, trade, and so on and so forth. So this basically is the basis of inequality that kicks in. But although social stratification happens to a lot more with better evidences from your Chalcolithic sort of phases, right? But okay, so social stratification is one thing that you could bring in. Again, social, cultural, economic, political, is type mein aap leke aaiye. Economic mein kya hoga, technology mein kya hoga? In terms of technology, polished stone tools, pottery, a little bit more of weaving and so on, because craft, okay, specialization aa raha hai. Economic change is basically from subsistence to surplus for the very first time. Okay, there is exchange, there is trade, there is a long distance trade, all these things. IVC mein you have a hypothesis regarding, land-based trade, maritime trade, right? So you have that political organization is basically coming in, meaning you have your chiefdoms, you also have like your proto-states, right? That are emerging. And one of the theory essentially says that it is because, only when you have these kind of proto-states or these chiefdoms, right, it is going to be easy to manage the surplus, and especially irrigation. Right? Irrigation is something that is done as a group, and for that, you have to sort of bring people together to be able to get that thing done. So some form of political organization, hence revolution, religion and rituals, and bahut sare aise points aap likh sakte, right? It also basically brought about environmental effect, right? So yes, scale, everything you can basically bring in, and then you can actually bring in different sort of dimensions here. So you have whole lot of theories starting from your child's oasis sort of theories. You have your population pressure wala theory. Okay, no one particular theory is going to sort of explain all. Correct? Okay, it is basically shaped by multiple sort of factors: ecological factors, population sort of factors, cultural factors, and all of this, right? But one thing is for sure, okay, if they're asking you to say a revolution, you say that it was some form of a true kind of a revolution, right? Humans basically move from not only interacting with the environments, you basically are also seeing that you will have instances wherein from being dependent on a particular sort of an environment, you're essentially coming to a phase wherein you're controlling an environment, right? So all of these things have to be brought into this answer in order to be able to say that it is a revolution. If you've been able to say this thing, you have given the perfect takeaway to complete this answer. Is this clear? What about critically discuss the centrality of African continent in the narrative of human evolution? I think this we have done a few times, right? So everything that you know about this particular topic goes into it, right? So Africa is often known as what is the phrase here? The cradle of civilization, the cradle of humankind. So initially we did not have this all the way till Africanness, right? Uske pehle 1856 mein Europe, 1890s mein you have your Peking man, Java man. Okay, so you have this. So with Africanness, it basically goes all the way back to your Africa, right? So Africa is often basically called as the cradle of humankind, cradle of civilization. So you have your fossil evidence, you have genetic evidence, you have archaeological evidence. All of these things are essentially pointing to Africa as the main primary sort of place, geography of human evolutionary history. Okay, so you can break this down into fossil evidence, you can break this down to archaeological evidence, you can break this down to genetic, molecular sort of evidence, out of Africa models and so on and so forth. So fossil evidence kya hai? So who are the ones that we have found hominin wise from here? So we have actually found many early hominins. You have your Sahelanthropus chadensis, central part of Africa 7 million years ago, right? You have your Ardipithecus ramidus that we talked about a little while ago. You have your Ardipithecus cadaba. You basically have your Australopithecus afarensis 3.2 million years ago. Lucy, basically all are from Africa. Africanus, right, that we have talked about, right? Your Taung child, right? East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa. So the genus Homo itself, the earliest Homo, the Homo habilis 2.5 million years ago, 2.4 million years ago, from Olduvai Gorge, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, right? All of these things. Homo erectus 1.9 million years ago, Cubifora, right? All of these things, right? East Africa. Right, the later Homo, which is your Homo Heidelberg, okay, so you have your Bodo, you have your Ethiopia, right? All of these things are also from your Africa, right? Even in terms of your Homo, the Homo fossil, okay, Homo kibish fossil, right? So you have all of these things also being part of your Africa. So if you take a look at all the way from Sahelanthropus, which is probably the earliest sort of hominin ka fossil that is available in today's time, okay, all the way till the most recent one, okay, which is our early sort of ancestor that is going to sort of move from Africa to the other parts, it all of them, you know, have some sort of, you know, link to your Africa. So Africa is the cradle of humankind. Archaeological evidence agar aapko dekhna hai, to Oldowan industry is there. You have Acheulean hand axes that have been found with Homo erectus, right? You have some rock art that has been found. You have symbolic behavior that has been found. Blombos cave is a great example. What else could I actually bring in here? Oldowan. You even have the today you have these stone tools that are dating back to your 3-point-something million years ago, 3.3 million years ago. That means even prior, okay, to what we consider as the Homo family, right? It's called the Lomekwi tool tradition. That is also present in Africa, right? Although we have not been able to say who is it. Is it Kenyanthropus, Platyops? Is it basically some form of Australopithecus? Okay, matlab that is another sort of a debate, right? So that is that. So ye ho gaya aapka fossil evidence, ye ho gaya aapka archaeological evidence. In terms of genetic and molecular sort of evidence, you have mitochondrial DNA studies. We just talked about it. Okay, Rebecca Kahn, you have your Stone King, you have your Wilson, 1987. They all traced you know, the living humans to a common maternal ancestor, which is basically your mitochondrial Eve, okay, 250,000 years ago to approximately 200,000 years ago. Similar sort of study has been taken up with a Y chromosome, right? And that also again points to 200 to 300,000 years ago. You know, we have the male ka ancestors as well, right? So you have found those as well. Today we have Svante Pabo, you know, and his studies, genomes of Neanderthals, Denisovans, all of these things, okay, they show that modern humans essentially emerged in Africa, okay, and then they later interbred with other sort of archaic populations that they met outside. Okay, so that is that. Out of Africa model is another sort of a dimension that you can bring in why this is central to the centrality of the African continent. Out of Africa essentially argues what? It is saying that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa first. Okay, then later they dispersed to Asia and then Europe and then Oceania in 60,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, and so on. They replaced, while they moved, the local archaic populations, which is your Neanderthals in your central West Asia, and then, you know, in Europe, you have your Denisovans in this part of your Asia, right? So and replacement also means that there is some amount of interbreeding. So meaning what we said, right? 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA has been found in non-African populations, meaning Eurasian population, Europe and Asian populations, right? So widely supported by fossil evidence is also genetic evidence also, right? Again, you know, iska critical perspectives bhi aap likh sakte ho. It is okay, but however, you know, out of Africa agar main keh raha hu, okay, then you also have the multi-regional sort of hypothesis, okay, Wolpoff. So he's basically arguing that Homo erectus, he left Africa, or, you know, they left Africa 1.8 million years ago, and from there on, okay, and then, you know, the regional populations basically evolved into whatever is the modern, the humans in that particular place. At the same time, there has been some amount of gene flow between these. Then you have some Asian discoveries that have been found, for instance, Demonisium, Georgicus, right? You know, there's a lot of variation with regard to the skull ka, the cranial capacities, okay, and generally they tend to be smaller, right? Okay, you have Floresiensis in parts of Southeast Asia, you have China, mein you have Erectus is there, archaic Homo sapiens is there, right? So it is a little more complex. Okay, that is that. And ye Africa, we say it is central, but Africa is a huge continent, right? So Homo sapien, yes, okay, in Africa, but we cannot necessarily say ki which region of Africa. But it's still, it means ki wo centrality of Africa is something that is definitely there. So, aaj ka view essentially is that Africa still remains central as the origin of the genus Homo, the modern humans, right? But modern research also says ki it is still complex. We don't have all the answers. It is not only the dispersal, okay, out of Africa wala dispersal, but there have been multiple dispersals. In fact, not only dispersal, there is also evidence of them back migrating, okay, and then again interbreeding. Right, so humanity has been shaped with a lot of complications, and we are trying to sort of figure it out. Right, so Africa, we can say, is the primary homeland, but not necessarily the only stage of human evolution. Right, so there has been a lot of really fun activities that have happened elsewhere as well, maybe even in South Asia, and that also becomes very important that we learn it. Okay, so that is that. So ye sab is basically what is expected here. How the study of variation in forms of marriage led to rethinking on the concepts of social reproduction, kinship, and family. So what exactly are the forms of marriage? Okay, and why did it result in so variation in forms of marriage? Okay, so it means ki what are the different forms of marriage and what are the variants with regard to this, and how did it result in rethinking in the concepts of social reproduction, kinship, and family. So what exactly is the variation in forms of marriage would be one. Okay, so pehle look at the concepts that you need here, right? Social reproduction. Social reproduction is basically how a society basically sustains, how it basically reproduces itself over generations, and this is not biologically. Okay, maybe biologically as well, which is meaning they're basically giving birth to children, but it's also about social reproduction, which means ki values and norms and ideas and ye sab basically being passed on, transmitted to the next generation, right? So if I can give you an example of social reproduction, cultural reproduction, it is, let's say, if you have the idea of caste endogamy, okay, being in India, it has to be reproduced, okay, generation after generation in order to maintain that caste hierarchy over generations, right? So this is the kind of idea here. So this is basically a social reproduction, transmission of your culture, your those sort of aspects. Kinship and family to aapko pata hai, right? So how does study of marriage variations in how does study of marriage variations basically reshape these three, which is your kinship and cultural reproduction, social reproduction, kinship, and family. So social reproduction with regard to marriage, right? So what is it? So for instance, reproduction, it's not only about having children today, right? Okay, within the heterosexual kind of a marriage, today you can basically have, bahut sare options are there. Marriage variations are basically polyandry, polygyny, same-sex marriages, same-sex unions, live-in partnerships. So multiple different kind of forms are there, right? So you will have all of these things. In fact, you take an example of, let's say, the Nayars, right? So Nayars and their Sambandham kind of union, basically, it basically makes you rethink, okay, what exactly does a legitimate child, okay, what is it? You're basically trying to rethink what is legitimacy, okay, what is inheritance, what is lineage, right? Okay, because you're seeing many other sort of variants within this. In terms of kinship, kya hota hai, right? So kinship was initially seen as, either marriage or it is descent, but today you can understand adoption hota hai. Same-sex marriages basically have, and sometimes, same-sex union hai. It is not necessarily marriage like in India, right? You cannot have marriage. So this basically goes beyond what we call as heterosexual marriages. It goes beyond reproduction, right? So again, it's basically shifting kinship, from blood ties to and one way kind of marriages to anything that is socially recognized kind of relationship in today's time period. Okay, and David Schneider basically talks about this, and that is in terms of family. Again, any kind of variance in terms of marriage is going to result in a different kind of a family, right? Polyandry amongst Todas and the Pahadi groups and all of that, right? So it's going to result in different kind of a family, yet it is a stable family because there are certain kind of purposes behind it, right? You have single parent families, you have blended families, right? In urban societies, all of these things, may not be the traditional types, right? But it will definitely show you key, different forms of marriage basically make you rethink these kind of concepts. These are also there, okay, and these are also stable kind of unions, right? So interesting kind of a question. ठीक है. So it's not a question जहाँ पे you don't know what different terms are, because we've already done this, right? Cultural reproduction is a question that was given already in your FLTs, okay, and wherein I basically explain कि वो क्या है, right? You know, I think this was with regard to religion and rituals, okay, through formal and informal, right? Formal is basically like, let's say, through textual, and informal is basically through the family wala transmission, right? We had already seen this. So I don't think there is anything in this particular part that you don't know. The only thing that you would have to do is that structure it in a manner jahan pe it is according to the demand of this particular question. Then uske baad wo concepts aapko use karna hai, and you have to bring in some specifics with regard to examples and studies and scholars and so on, right? So that would be that. And the last bunch is this particular question. Okay, so this also, in fact, paper 1, I think our students have gone with every single option, right? Okay, which is kind of surprising, because many times, you know, they the kind of choices made by the students are generally the same. Okay, maybe one question is kind of different, but this time we have options. All the kind of questions have been taken. So postmodernism, in fact, this was a question last year as well, I believe. Okay, as a 20 marker, and it's a 20 marker now, but again, it is, tell me with regard to social justice and empowerment of marginal communities, genome-wide disease association studies. In fact, like, this is very similar to the question that we had last time, which is single mutation related kind of diseases. Okay, health and disease. In fact, a lot of focus on health and disease. Examine the utility of human remains in forensic analysis, facial reconstruction. Again, I think this question we did it like kitne baar. Okay, at least 2-3 baar to humne kiya hai, right? So I think this was another block that you guys could have taken. So what would it be? So let's say genome-wide disease association studies. See, genome-wide association studies essentially means that, you know, these are these large scale meta kind of studies. Okay, so it is, you're basically studying the entire genome in order to identify different sort of genetic variants. Okay, matlab, you know, your SNPs, right? Single nucleotide polymorphisms, right? Which are associated. So that SNP is basically associated with a particular sort of a disorder, with a particular sort of a disease, right? And all of these things basically go back to the results of the HGP 2003. May once we got it, so we understand that 20,000, 25,000 genes are there, and you know which of these things are going to result in what, and you know, uske mutation can basically result in what, right? So GWAS essentially works in that manner. Matlab, you have to basically collect DNA from both people who have the disease and the people who don't have a particular disease. Then you have to basically go through hundreds of these SNPs, across that particular genome, and statistically isko analyze karna padega ki iske allele frequency kya hai, to matlab kaun sa locus mein kya hai, what kind of a sequence ATCG is going to be associated with what, and ATCG, okay, GACT, matlab मान लो कि that is going to be associated with what, right? This time mein, that is your GWAS. So meaning what kind of genetic sequence is going to be resulting in what kind of disease or what kind of non-disease, right? That is that. So matlab, see, for instance, right, so this could be single mutation sort of disease. It could also be like, you know, your complex diseases, right? So it could be, for instance, you know, we have studied in polygenic inheritance, right? Type 2 diabetes, right? It is caused by the variants, matlab, that TCF7L2, right? You have your cardiovascular disease, okay, 9P. We have your BRCA1, BRCA2, which is essentially your 13Q, 17Q, 17Q, 13Q, right? You have your autoimmune disorders, HLA, right? Many of these things, and these things have some significance. What is that significance? Significance because personalized medicine, precision medicine, isme bahut useful hote hain, right? So we have basically talked about this PRS, which is basically the polygenic risk score. So depending upon, you know, what is the, you can study this and actually say ki aapka genetic risk kya hai, and then basically goes to your genetic counseling, right? So you are able to predict the risk of heart disease early, of breast cancer early, right? Okay, of you could probably be provided with cholesterol reducing sort of drugs or something. Another sort of a significance or application could be pharmacogenomics, right? So for instance, you know, certain groups of people basically have a kind of a genetic variant that results in a different sort of a response to a particular drug, right? So HLA-B variant, for instance, you know, that is an example of something that certain sort of drugs basically affect them differently. Arya Vaishya community of Andhra Pradesh, right? So they have a different sort of a response to anesthetics, right? So there are many of these kind of factors that basically come in, so lots and lots of applications with regard to this, right? In fact, even at a larger population level also, you have a lot of these kind of studies that are being taken up. So for certain kind of pockets may, certain kinds of populations may, you will actually see thalassemia related sort of variants of hemoglobin, right? That is a common sort of an issue. You have sickle cell kind of variants of population that is there. So that is that. Okay. Again, so these kind of questions, you try to come out with some more sort of subheadings. For instance, limitations, you could basically talk about it, right? So a human genome project is basically like, one genome from America, okay, from Buffalo, New York, right? So that is basically what it is, okay? So it has much less, generally this is HGP ka limitation. You could bring in African, Asian, various indigenous populations, unke, studies, and GWAS is basically limited in comparison to, the European sort of populations, right? So that is that. So, you have to sort of do more of these things, right? Okay. And also take care of the genetic privacy. You take care of misuse of data and so on and so forth. Ye sab hum karenge na, so there is a lot more sort of benefits than risks. Okay, but again, provided ye ethical issues, genetic, ye privacy, more data ka protection, all these things are basically taken care of. Okay, so if you do this, then this is going to be great. What about theories of postmodernism in social justice? Yeah, let's take a look at this. Human remains in forensic analysis, direct from the syllabus. Right, so what do you have here, right? So for instance, in case you have to, how do you basically study human remains? What could it be? It could be basically proper biological profile aapko construct karna hai. So it could be about like teeth, it could be your bones, it could be the blood, it could be the DNA sample and so on, right? So agar, see for instance, if you have to find sex, right, DNA will basically tell you everything, X hai ki Y hai. But if let's say ki pelvis, the subpubic angle, the sciatic notch, right, the skull ka the traits of the skull, basically, ki kitna robust hai and so on, that will basically tell you ki the sex. If it is about the age, you can basically have the dental eruption, you can basically have the epiphyseal closure aap dekh sakte ho, right? And then your the fusion of the bones here, right? Okay, so you can have many of these things, xiphoid process, okay, bahut sare, you could basically bring in terms of stature, you have the there are certain sort of indices that basically tell you ki if you give me the femur bone, I can possibly tell you within a small range of error ki us person ka height kya ho sakta hai, right? You can basically understand bahut sare things, ancestry, population belongs to which kind of a race. For instance, cranial indices ko aap dekhoge, right, you will be able to say ki based on the morphometric kind of features, you will be able to tell ki which possible race they could be from. Now you can't say it like 100% with certainty, but there are some what is it called, population likeness, something along those lines. Okay, so the likelihood of that, probability likeness, I forget exactly what is the term for it, but something along those lines. Okay, the likelihood of it belonging to so and so particular group is higher, right? So that is that. Individual identification kar sakte ho. For instance, a person does not have, let's say ki a particular let's say a canine, or there is basically like some sort of a decay that is there, and if you have these dental records, okay, which is generally present in Western society, then you can actually say yes, it is basically this particular person has been found. Okay, skeletal anomalies, for instance, my knee bone has been broken, I have wedge compression fracture, in my spine. You can find me, right? Because if you have my records, okay, you can do DNA analysis, bone marrow, teeth, hair follicles, all of these things, nuclear DNA le sakte ho, mitochondrial DNA sakte ho, so many things you could basically use with regard to the human remains in order to do forensic analysis, whether it is for crime analysis, whether it is for accident sites made to find paternity diagnosis ke liye, whether it is for immigration and those kind of reasons ke liye, bahut sare things. Then what a second part of the question, discuss the facial reconstruction techniques. I basically already explained this multiple times. What is it? You have the American method, you have the British method, you have the Manchester method, bahut sare hai, right? So you have this, right? So up करना क्या है आपको, पहले आपको skeletal analysis करना है. You have to establish age, sex, ancestry, because that is required for you to come out with the next part, which is the tissue depth marker, right? So based on which particular race, which particular age, which particular racial group, all these things, based on that, you have these population averages, right? So then based on that, you're going to be given this much amount of tissue, this much amount of cheek tissue, this much amount of lip tissue, this much amount of chin, and so on. Then you basically have the reconstruction process. It used to be with clay, then it was wax, and today it is like 2D, 3D. right? So that is essentially what happens here, right? So computer software is used to model the muscles and the skin and the soft tissues, right? Okay, around the skull and so on and so forth, right? And then finalization में मतलब hair color देते हो, eye color देते हो, skin color देते हो, but these are all approximates. In case you're basically trying to find out कि मतलब 4000 BC कैसे होगा, right? You know, you're again going with data that you have about ancestry and some sort of DNA clues, but we cannot tell with certainty. Does it have applications? 100%. Lots of applications. Identifications in terms of criminal cases where bodies are basically unrecognizable, right? If there is a mass disaster that is there, right? So वहाँ से you can actually मतलब victim कौन है, you will be able to sort of identify, right? In terms of archaeology, you will be able to sort of reconstruct the facial sort of features. मतलब this has been a little more common and you've seen this in the news, right? Okay, Tutankhamun is an example that I've shown you in the past as well. मतलब foundation वगैरह में हम करते हैं, right? So many of these things, but understand there are limitations to this. This is not an exact science, right? Two different people, two different groups that are basically trying to reconstruct, you know, the face might give you two different, you know, maybe it may be similar but need not be 100% the same. Just like, you know, sketch, if you have a criminal kuch activity ho gaya, if somebody is basically describing this is what I saw, you know, it may not be very similar also. But however, this is basically something that can give you a PL, probabilistic likeness. Yeah, that's the term. Probabilistic likeness, which means that it is not a perfect portrait, but it's a probabilistic likeness wala portrait. Okay, it basically relies on the averages of a particular data set that you have. So agar ek particular population के बारे में है, you have certain kind of averages. So tissue depth कितना होना चाहिए, cheek, bones नहीं, cheek and you know your lips and chin and all these things के लिए कितना देना है, right? So specific. So population average ले रहे हो, but possibly every individual is unique, right? So that variation may be missed, right? So ये है, so lots of this thing, but again, you know these two like really well. And the last one is theories of postmodernism. So theories of postmodernism, so you have to bring in multiple, ठीक है, are relevant in promoting social justice and empowerment of marginalized communities. I guess this is the whole thing, ठीक है? So it is basically asking you entire postmodernism, just that it is crafted and slightly different. See, postmodernism क्या है? It is a particular way of thinking that rejects this universal meta narratives or grand narratives, the postmodern condition, right? So your Lyotard, right? So what does he say? 1979. So instead of one truth, it basically values many different sort of perspectives, many different kind of voices, right? Okay, it basically tries to integrate local knowledge. It takes a look at the people ka lived experiences. So this makes it very useful for understanding and empowering these marginalized communities. So it is perfect for it. So the first point would be you could basically go with the theories, the various theories, okay, or the various sort of contributions or the various sort of perspectives. First one, the rejection of grand narratives. So modernist ideas, they basically, modernism mein kya hai? It is basically you're trying to bring in one single story of progress or one single story of development or one single story of one something. Yahan pe you're trying to bring in, at least according to Lyotard and so on, you're basically trying to bring in no one kind of a narrative, right? You're basically trying to construct multiple stories. So the history of, let's say कि अगर आप दलित निकाल रहे हो या women निकाल रहे हो या tribes निकाल रहे हो, LGBTQIA+, you know, all these things are going to be kind of different, right? So that is basically that. So no one particular meta grand narrative. Power and knowledge, Michael Foucault, right? So what does he say? He's saying that knowledge is basically tied to power, and knowledge is used by the dominant groups that basically control that what we so called truth jo hai, right? And that can be used to silence the other voices, right? So when you are studying, you have to basically try to integrate, you have to try to study the local discourses, okay, the local sort of voices, right? So the local voices that can basically challenge caste, it can challenge gender hierarchies, it can basically challenge maybe the colonial sort of hierarchy or the racial sort of hierarchies and so on and so forth, right? So that is another one. Okay, then postmodernism, deconstruction, okay, Derrida and Jacques Derrida, and basically deconstruction, that basically shows that categories like primitive and civilization, or a man and a woman. All these things are basically socially constructed, right? So this can basically break down all these kind of binaries that keep these kind of hierarchies. Okay, it can have the potential to keep the marginal groups more oppressed, right? All of these things can basically come in. So for instance, this can actually break concepts like your caste purity, because that still marginalizes certain groups, right? So regardless of how well they do, you still have this hierarchy, the ritual purity, the ritual pollution, these kind of factors are basically brought in. You would also bring in, the aspect of valuing the local voices or the subaltern voices, right? So whether it is Sanjeev Barua or whether it is, your Nandini Sundar, whether it is your, so these Alpa Shah or Gayatri Spivak, right? So these kind of voices, right? So they basically use this postmodern sort of critique to reconstruct whatever they are basically studying, right? Whether it is peasants, whether it is tribes, whether it is women, whether it is anybody who is marginalized, right? So great works like Can the Subaltern Speak, right? So these kind of works basically talk about the same thing, right? So you bring in all these kind of elements. This is a question that is completely about postmodernism, not a very narrow kind of this thing. It's basically telling you to discuss all the kind of theories that is relevant in promoting social justice and empowerment of marginalized communities. That is what postmodernism is, right? It basically says, not only should you just you have to question. That's basically what it says, right? So postmodernism, to a great extent, most of the theories, basically it matters a lot for social justice. Okay, it questions the dominant voices. Okay, it brings in the marginalized voices into the discourse, into the discussions. Okay, it gives it a lot of importance. It tries to expose power hierarchies. It tries to expose ye knowledge system or the truth that is basically there ki kahan se aa raha hai. So a lot of contributions made by Lyotard and Foucault and Derrida and all of these kind of things. It can basically help reject these grand narratives. And makes a lot of room for different voices of different communities, especially of the marginalized communities. If you can basically bring these sort of elements in your answer, I think that would be a phenomenal, you will have actually done what is the requirement for this particular question, right? Now, to be able to do that in 4 pages, that's not that difficult. To be able to do this according to the kind of question, the way they have crafted is going to be a little bit of a challenge, especially when it comes to having to do it within 14 minutes. That part is going to be slightly a challenge. Now, if I have to come back here and give you my final take, okay, paper was not difficult. Okay, for those of you who have done it, I think most of you came out happy, right? Okay, but happy means good because, at the end of the day, you're relieved. Okay, but the highest scores that are going to be available, close to 160, right? Okay, let's say you have a chance of being able to get to 160. Okay, it depends on a few factors, right? Again, if I can go back here, right, it requires all 3, right? First thing has to be question ka demand understanding. Second thing is ability to use the concepts. Okay, and the last one is scholars. Okay, studies, examples, specifics, any kind of specifics, right? So the point being is that, of course, you want to use a lot of specifics in your answer. Okay, you want to put in facts into your answer, right? But you have to understand what was the demand of the question. The question, the paper one, barring maybe 2-3 questions, I think many questions were actually doable. The only thing is that it is integrating many concepts into one particular question. In some questions, it's giving you a very narrow way of saying ki you have to address it in so and so kind of manner. Pehle you explain what is ecology vis-a-vis nutrition. You have to explain what is culture vis-a-vis nutrition. You have to you get the picture, right? And then you have to talk about the intersectionality. Then you have to basically talk about the significance of that intersectionality. So unless you are able to sort of understand through a lot of answer writing volume, you might have been able to answer that particular question, but may not be to the extent of what is expected for that particular question for you to be able to score in the top 1%, right? So that is that. There are many other sort of questions which I thought, I think many of the questions you guys are already done. So depending upon which one you had revised well and which one you were able to sort of bring, this particular part, right? You would have possibly chosen those kind of questions, right? Completion of the paper, I think, I think a couple of questions you must have made. You have created an answer, but whether you have really gotten very high sort of marks for it, I'm talking about everybody, right? Wahan pe I don't think it is going to make much of a difference. 35 to 40 good pages is all that requires to be able to score 150 plus, right? But you have to have 35 to 40. The fetal origin, possibly the Purum and their kinship practices, these kind of questions are not going to make much of a difference. Whether you attempted them, you did not attempted them, it's probably going to create 1 mark, 1.5 marks ka difference, right? But that is not going to be the reason why somebody is getting 150, somebody is getting 100, right? So that is that. One more thing is that you had to have a lot of conceptual clarity, especially for the 20 markers. It basically required you to be able to answer, for instance, that social reproduction, kinship, family, in order to be able to connect it to, the variation in marriages, right? So all these things basically require a good hold on that particular subject, right? Okay. It has also gone into some areas that basically require you to bring in a few extra dimensions. For instance, centrality of Africa, right? So meaning you have to think in terms of archaeological evidence, fossil-based evidence, genetic sort of evidence, limitations, right? So all of these things were kind of required, right? So concept, I think this paper was a little more concept heavy. Okay, it did challenge you in terms of trying to understand what is the exact demand of that particular question. I think this was slightly a big of it's a bigger challenge this year, okay, in comparison to some of the past years, right? So I think this is the approach that UPSC is taking, right? They're not wanting to test you whether you have that ability to rote learn things, right? Today, material ki koi kami nahi hai. Right? Who has mugged up the most amount of things is basically not what they're trying to test. They're basically trying to give you, okay, based on your knowledge, okay, ki answer this. Wahan pe aapko think karna padega, connect karna padega, and craft karna padega, right? So somebody, it becomes a little easier for those who are like well prepared, especially who have a good hold, whose foundation in anthropology, whose understanding of anthropology is a lot stronger. It becomes slightly easier. Slightly nahi, it becomes a lot easier for you to be able to show that you are different. You are one notch above, or possibly even a couple of notches above. So anyways, I hope that, how to approach these kind of questions is, something that you have understood. Most of these kind of questions, I've already discussed it with you, and I have liberally used your ideas as well in how you have approached it, right? I think you guys have done phenomenally well. I think it was a good, year for some of you foundation batch students. It is a good 3 months for the rest of you who are part of the test series students. I hope for the students who have not written mains, it basically gives you an idea ki matlab, what is mains like, where is anthropology ka paper going, right? What is the direction in which it is going, right? What does it basically take in order to be able to study for it and prepare for it, okay, and to do well in it, right? So it is not rote learning. It is not memorization of a lot of facts, okay? It is a lot more of trying to understand the demand of that particular question and applying concepts. So conceptual clarity is something that was definitely required to a great extent to be able to craft according to the demand of this particular question. So I hope that many of you, I have a strong feeling that we could possibly have the highest score in anthropology this year. But again, it is up to God, okay, because there is 1% always that probability of, God's blessings, or we can call it luck, right? But let's hope that, you get what is most important, okay, and that is going to be your first rank, your first service ka choice, your second service ka choice, third service ka choice within that. Okay. So hope this was helpful. We will have another session, jahan pe again, one quick marathon session in which we discuss your paper 2 as well. Okay. So that's it for tonight. You guys have a great evening, and I will see you guys in the next paper 2 ka analysis. Take care. Bye-bye.